Mi disculpa, don Eduardo.
Was?
Con permiso.
Oye, Mateo. Déjate el bigote, se te ve bien.
Sí, don Eduardo.
Hey guys, Pete here. When I first watched this first episode, my curiosity on how they were going to pick up with the Gene scene was through the roof. And this is not a Gene scene, it's a Saul scene. Or perhaps it would be better described as a post-Saul scene. And it's a teaser in the true sense of the word in that it brings up a lot more questions than it answers. A much repeated line about Saul as a character is that we never saw his home life in Breaking Bad. And here we get a look at that to start things off. The things we can put together are that this is after Ed the Disappearer helped Saul and Walter White escape Albuquerque. If there was any question about whether the authorities would have Jimmy on their radar and still be looking for him in the Gene timeline, this appears to confirm that without a doubt. And I think you could get really close to saying that Kim wasn't around behind the scenes in the Breaking Bad timeline based on the way this place looks. I just can't imagine her using that golden toilet every day. And also, most of what we see them collecting as evidence looked like it belonged to Jimmy. And there were a lot of recognizable gems mixed in there from throughout the series. This brown suit that pops up later in the first episode, which I think is the same one he was wearing in the first scene he shared with Kim. We see things like the mall walking shoes from one of his lowest points when he was turning the women at Sandpiper against Irene. One of my favorites was this Panavision baseball cap that he was wearing when he was trying to sell the commercials. The autographed Richie Blackmore guitar is there. We have Beanie Babies and bingo balls. The photo that Mesa Verde ripped off for their logo, burner phones, and so on. And I really like the way that they put this all together. It has a dreamlike quality that pairs nicely with this idea of everything that he built up crumbling down, falling apart. All of this stuff that he collected is being seized and taken away. And then probably the most intriguing thing there is the Zafiro Añejo stopper that we see fall out of the truck at the very end. This was Kim's trophy from their first scam as Victor with a K and Giselle, when they drank for free while Ken Wins thought he was securing a big payday, and it makes you wonder how Jimmy came to be in possession of it. I can't linger here too long, but I'll say if you're going to break from tradition and not start out in Omaha, then this is how you do it. It's nostalgic in the right ways. It kind of transports you right back into the middle of this world, and there's so much to think about after the fact. I assume this means that we'll spend much longer in the Gene timeline later in the season, and that's something I hoped would happen anyways. In the current timeline, we pick up right where season 5 left off, and while they had to take some time to reestablish where everyone was, I don't think they dialed back the pacing as much as what we saw in earlier seasons. Things are moving forward across all the different stories, and there's an urgency that makes it feel like we are moving towards the ending. I was impressed in how quickly they moved things along with Lalo and with Jimmy and Kim's plans to go after Howard without things feeling rushed. They still took time where it made sense, and I think a great example of that is when Jimmy is having second thoughts in the restaurant. Kim is trying to get the ball rolling, he has reservations, and the server comes up to interrupt and draw things out. He has a chance to pump the brakes but can't bring himself to do it. You see that Lalo has limped his way over to a neighbor's house. This is directly after the attack on his compound, and from the conversation, you get the idea that he's helped out this couple in the past. When the husband goes to shave, Lalo tells him to keep the mustache and the soul patch, and when he takes the scissors on the table apart, you realize that this is going to be his body double. Because Lalo is such a charismatic character and fun to watch, I like how they have him do something to showcase how brutal he can be right in the beginning. They did this same thing with Fred at Travel Wire. Later, when the cousins arrive at the hacienda, you see that the federales are there, they're collecting evidence. There's a shot of the lock that Nacho opened laying on the ground, and you notice that the roof has a hole from fire damage, which is suspicious because we didn't see that happen in the season 5 finale. When they go inside, you put it all together that Lalo faked a fire to burn the body of his neighbor and make it look like he died in the attack. Later, when Gus is looking over the evidence, you realize that he went as far as getting that dental work for his neighbor to get this all set up just in case. The cousins lay a Santa Muerta card on the body after covering it in one of their suit jackets, and this is a nice callback to their first appearance in the 3rd season of Breaking Bad. At this point, they think he's dead, which means everyone will think the same, and that all works to Lalo's advantage in the early going. Gus gets a call from Bolsa telling him that Lalo's dead and that Nacho is a rat. Don Eladio has put a price on his head, and they plan to bring him in alive so they can figure out who he's working for. When Mike comes in, Gus reveals that he's skeptical because the mission was a success, but all the mercenaries are dead. Something feels off. Mike is more concerned about Nacho. He wants to extract him, saying he's done everything he was asked and that he deserves his respect. It's clear, though, that Gus has different plans, and later when Mike's at home watching Kaylee, he ignores Nacho's call. He's on the run in a foreign country with no one he can really trust. He's made contact with Tyrus, who told him about the price on his head, and he's in the middle of Salamanca territory where everyone is looking to collect the bounty. He eventually makes it to the motel safe house after dark, and if you remember, he let the mercenaries into Lalo's hacienda at 3 a.m., so he's had a whole day of running and hiding. This has all been set up, so there's a room waiting for him. He goes inside and finds a manila envelope with money and a handgun, and there's a cell phone there, so he talks to Tyrus, who tells him that it's going to take a couple of days to get him out of there. He just needs to stay out of sight until it's time to be picked up, and he gives him the very specific instructions that if anyone comes to the door, shoot. In this first episode, you see Kim and Jimmy pick up where they left off at the hotel. It's notable that Jimmy's already awake staring at the ceiling before Kim's alarm goes off. They head back to their apartment. She has her new pro bono cases to deal with, and he has to meet with the ADA in charge of the Juan de Guzman case. With help from the recurring character Detective Roberts, they've put it together that the address he gave and the family that showed up at court were fake. They think he ran, and they don't want to wait until his hearing in 6 weeks to start looking for him. Jimmy does a pretty good job of fighting them off, right up until he slips and calls him Lalo. He tries to cover up the mistake, but this will likely come back up. He's got that on his mind later when he meets up with Kim, who fills him in on her day. She's trying to save the kid who Jimmy lent his brown suit to. His rich friend is trying to blame him for a robbery. And when Jimmy says it sounds like a day from hell, you see that she's actually beaming. She says it was one of the best days of her life. And then when she thinks about it, she clarifies her professional life. She really likes helping people who would slip through the cracks otherwise. And when she asks him how his day was, he doesn't bring up the Lalo situation. Instead, he tells her about the car he rented, and that leads to her saying that she thinks Saul Goodman would drive something with a little more flair, and that Saul Goodman has an office, something eye-catching, a cathedral of justice. She wants to start looking for something soon. They make a plan for that Saturday, and it's a little bit surprising to think that she's fueling this transition into the Saul Goodman that we know. She looks happy, but she also has an agenda. After a pause, she tells him that she wants to discuss first moves against Howard, and as I mentioned before, Jimmy still doesn't appear to be on board with this. I think we have to remember the timeline here. He's still absolutely feeling the effects of his trip to the desert. You can't miss the sunburn that's still on his face. And he did go talk to Mike, where he was assured that Lalo was going to be killed, but he's still a little bit in shock from everything that happened. She thinks that they can get Sandpiper settled and leave Howard standing. A little bruised maybe, but still standing. And she brings up the idea that they should start with Cliff Main. She says that they have to pace it right, and that if they move too fast, they'll see them coming. And adds that it has to make sense. It doesn't have to hold up in court, but there has to be a reason for everything. We don't have to wait long to find out what they're trying to do. They go to Howard's Country Club. Jimmy has signed up for a tour, which gets derailed when Kevin Wachtel sees him and complains to the membership director. He makes an excuse about the club having a 2-year waiting list, a clear turn from how he was treating him just a minute ago. And so Jimmy breaks into a hilarious performative tirade about how they're trying to keep him out because he's Jewish, because of his name, which of course Jimmy McGill is not. This sets Kevin off. He continues to push his buttons, nearly provoking him to violence. And then he takes the opportunity to ask to use the bathroom because the stress is hell on his diverticulitis. He gets access to the men's locker room, which was where he was trying to go the whole time. There he clogs one of the toilets to create a diversion. He's able to find out where Howard's locker is. Kim sees that they're returning and sends him a message to abort, which he ignores. And that leads to him having to get naked to pretend he's just getting out of the shower, drying his hair when they come in. The plan was to get a bag of drugs to fall out of Howard's locker when he opened it so that Cliff would see it. Howard is as surprised as he is, so Cliff isn't really suspicious, but it's something that'll stick in his mind since there isn't a good explanation for it either. Kim, who seemed to be exhilarated by the entire process, especially looking through those binoculars, worries that it might be too subtle, but Jimmy assures her that it was perfect. And you do see Cliff thinking as Howard drives off. It was pretty impressive how Jimmy rose to the occasion in the heat of things considering everything else that's going on, and it makes you realize just how good of a team these two make when they're so inclined. Lalo is on his way to the border where he pays a couple of coyotes to help him cross. Before he gets in the truck to leave, he decides to call Hector, who's pleasantly surprised since he thought he was dead. He explains what happens, calling Gus a coward for sending paramilitaries into his home. He pulls out the episode's F-bombs to say fuck Bolsa, fuck Eladio, and declares, I'm going to come north, I'm going to hurt him, and then I'm going to kill him. Hector wants to say something, so he starts going through the alphabet, and he's asking if he has proof, which he doesn't. And then he thinks about it and says, wait a minute, there is proof. And he says he knows where to find it and that he'll see Hector soon. He comes back to the truck to get his money back from the coyotes since he isn't leaving. They refuse, and then we get this shot where they close the truck so that we watch the border crossers inside as they listen to things go bad outside for the coyotes. Lalo executes them both. He opens the truck back up and tells the crossers that they're going to have to find a different way north, and then he gives them their money back before he jumps in the truck and goes back the way he came.
You're going to use the stick, right?
The stick, yeah, well, it's a big stick. It's huge. But I know these people. They're more carrot types, especially her.
In episode 2, Mike goes over to Nacho's place. He breaks the news to his girlfriends that he won't be coming back and gives them some cash to hit the road for good. He examines Nacho's safe and orders a replacement before breaking into it. While he's taking everything out, he discovers the fake IDs he had made and pockets the one for his father. He puts the other one and most of the cash in the new safe that Victor delivers and adds a new envelope before locking it up to make it look like it's exactly how Nacho left it. Over at the chicken farm, Tyrus presents all the evidence that the federales have from the crime scene. He has the photo of the burnt body, those dental records do check out, and Gus is being presented with evidence that's hard to refute, but he still feels like something's up. He asks about the fire and then calls Bolsa saying that he has an idea about how they can keep the peace. Later, he'll go to see Hector at Casa Tranquila, with Bolsa there to facilitate the meeting. He makes a show of it, saying that they're all Eladio's men, and a strike against one is a strike against them all. And we see that when Hector reaches out his hand to shake, the look on his face tells Gus that Lalo is still alive, so he got the information that he wanted. And he also knows that Bolsa will go to Nacho's house and break into his safe and discover that envelope. When he does, we see the document inside shows bank transfers, and then it has the number for the motel safe house written at the bottom. There, Nacho had noticed that there was an air conditioner running in a little boarded up shack across the parking lot from his room. When he sees someone move inside, he decides to push out the air conditioner in his room so he can sneak out the back and then come back around and surprise the person who's watching him. The guy makes the case that he doesn't know who hired him or even who Nacho is. He's being paid by a voice on the phone, and he's just there to watch the room and tell them if he leaves. Nacho would suspect that this is Gus because why wouldn't the Salamancas have already busted into his room? So he calls Tyrus to tell him that he's thinking of running, and then he hangs up on him. Eventually, Tyrus calls the guy's phone who's watching, and that reveals that Gus is the one who hired him. Nacho knocks him out and gets ready to run, but at the same time, Eladio's men that Bolsa sent arrive at the motel. He had ducked into a truck, so they walked right by to start kicking in the doors. He's spotted and he kills one of their guys, and another guy advances on his truck shooting at him, but the cousins kill him because they need to capture Nacho alive. He's able to hotwire the truck before they get to him, and after a face-off, he plows his way out of the parking lot. It's a win, but things still don't look great for him being able to get away on his own. Later, we find out the truck is found, but he escaped. Everyone in the cartel still believes that Lalo's dead, and we actually see some cracks in Gus's facade as he's receiving the news. We see his hand twitch, and then he knocks over a glass when he's pouring some water. Mike tells him that if Lalo was coming, they would know, and that he knows he can't make a move without a reason that the bosses can get behind. He needs to find Varga alive and get him to talk. This means that even though Nacho's smart, he's eventually going to get caught, and Mike wants to take 4 guys across the border to find him before they do. Instead of doing that, Gus wants him to go get Nacho's dad and bring him there, and Mike flat out says no. Tyrus pulls out his gun. Mike closes and locks the door and says, "You don't understand, that's not happening." This is one of those scenes that manages to be so tense even though I know how the story ends for each of the characters involved. Mike delivers the line from the trailer saying, "Whatever happens next, it's not going to go down the way you think it is," and then Nacho calls his phone. He gets the go-ahead to answer it. You don't hear their conversation. You just hear Mike say that it's not his call, and then he tells Gus he wants to talk to him, and it cuts away before you find out what happens. At their apartment, Kim and Jimmy are trying to come up with something that will get Cliff to want to set a meeting with a potential client, but then not want to pursue the case. They're trying to plant more seeds about Howard having a cocaine problem. Kim comes up with an idea that she's sure Jimmy will hate. He goes to a roadside trailer that has the inflatable Statue of Liberty that was above his office in Breaking Bad and is featured in the BCS opening credits sequence. Betsy and Craig Kettleman are inside to make their first appearance since season 1. She's not happy to see him since he stole and returned their ill-gotten pile of cash back then, and Craig's reaction to Jimmy really underlines what made these characters so much fun. They're despicable criminals who delude themselves into believing that they're the victims, and you gotta love it. After all this time, Betsy still thinks that Saul's the bad one. When she forces him outside, Jimmy lays the perfect trap. He dangles a promise of exoneration and that he's found grounds for a large civil suit in their case. He knows how Betsy feels about him and that she won't trust him, so he says he needs some assurances that she won't take the information to someone like Cliff Maine. It's the perfect setup. He knows Betsy will fire him. He throws in the idea that if she mentions where she got this information, that he'll be entitled to a cut to make sure she doesn't say anything, and it ends with her thinking that she's just outmaneuvered him. They more or less go straight to Davis and Maine. We see another returning character. Jimmy's old babysitter from his time there, Aaron, comes in to tell Cliff that they dropped in. When he asks why they think HHM didn't provide proper counsel, Betsy offers up the cocaine addiction accusations, and Craig hilariously says that he knows this because it was common knowledge out in the yard. They sound crazy and there's a conflict of interest, but you can see that it worked perfectly to get Cliff thinking about the accusations. Jimmy sets a meeting, and when Kim sees that he's grabbing some cash, they get into a discussion about the carrot and the stick. Jimmy acknowledges that the stick she has in mind is huge, but he knows these people. They're more carrot types, especially Betsy. Because she doesn't agree with his assessment, Kim decides to join him at the meeting. She turns out to be right. The Kettlemans are upset after visiting a bunch of real lawyers that all rained on their parade. He tries to offer them money to smooth things over, and they're not in the mood for the carrot. Instead, they insist that he needs to exonerate Craig and threaten to go to Howard if he doesn't make it happen. So, true to their nature, the Kettlemans' new business involves stealing from their clients. Kim says enough of the carrot, picks up the phone, and talks to someone she knows at the IRS on speaker. She lays out their scam, and Betsy eventually breaks, promising they'll do whatever she wants. She leans in on threatening them to drive home the point and leaves feeling pretty confident they'll never talk about what happened. Jimmy lingers behind to give them the money anyway, which Kim asks him about when he goes outside, and it's interesting to see where they both are at this phase of the plan. This feels like a glimpse of a new facet in Kim's personality, and when Jimmy climbs into the car, he murmurs wolves and sheep, recalling that flashback to his childhood in the family store. As they drive away, we see that someone is following them. Initially, I thought this was Lalo, but then I watched the teaser for the next episode and realized that's probably not the case, and the episode ends there. This was a fantastic way to start things. Setting the table can sometimes feel more like a chore during the beginning of any new season of a show, but bringing a teaser like what we have here can really smooth things over. What can you even say about this house that Saul Goodman lived in? Does that tell us he eventually got the Sandpiper settlement? Could this be a gift from the cartel? I mean, the way it's decorated. Or did he really become the kind of person that buys tiger stripe bedding? I understand the concept of being dedicated to the bit, but this is something for a guy who lived in the back of a nail salon. And that stopper, what is that saying to us? Did he inherit this after Kim's demise? Did she leave it for him when she split town? I still don't believe that she lived in that house, but is that what it's trying to say? At this point, everything still feels like it's on the table. In a show that always seems to improve, everything is still working. It looks great. There were so many memorable shots. The performances are at a level we've come to expect, and there's an added sense of dread hanging over all of these meticulously planned out moves that the characters are making. I'll come back to that complexity and how flawlessly things are progressing in a minute, because none of this can end well. Nacho's situation is incredibly dire. I can't imagine what it would feel like knowing the cartel is looking for you when you're deep in their territory and you know they've got torture on their minds. There's a price on your head, you can't trust the person that put you there, and you just have to stay put. Vince Gilligan directed the second episode and brought some of those shootout chops that we got to look at in Bagman, and it's hard to imagine how Nacho gets away. It's also wild to see Mike's reaction when Gus tries to use his father as an incentive. It feels like there's some real tension building between these two characters. The idea of Lalo coming north again is ominous, in that it brings Kim into a dangerous position. Jimmy is about to learn what being a friend of the cartel can mean. Just like Mateo learned that all that fantastic dental work came with a price. And Lalo's seen enough of Kim to know that she'd be an upgrade from what he's getting from Jimmy. It seems possible that he's coming after them, but it's a lot more likely that he's going to use them in a situation where he shouldn't be able to move around that easily. I really love all the callbacks, the returning characters, and reusing all these objects that we can recognize. You always hear about building a world that feels lived in. And what I love about all these things that pop back up, like an ant on a fingertip that makes you think about Jimmy's first introduction to Lalo, or the H.G. Wells book we see in the opening, and then later on Kim and Jimmy's nightstand in their room, it all makes it feel like a world where we're comfortable, where we recognize things, where we're a part of what's happening. Character-wise, there's a lot to parse in what's happening between Jimmy and Kim, and how they're jumping into this plan against Howard. The setup is there, it's put together really well, it's always impressive to watch these two work together, but Jimmy committed a big misstep when he brought up Lalo's name at the courthouse. Kim is driving the action, she's got her foot on the gas and doesn't seem interested in letting up. And I feel like her pulling back in the Mesa Verde situation felt like it was the last time we were going to see her do something like that. They've essentially switched positions here, and it's wild to think that she's playing such a big part in helping him transition into Saul Goodman. There are moments here where you wonder if she's using Jimmy to accomplish what she has in mind rather than working with him. It's an interesting dynamic where she could be turning him into something she could never be, and I don't know what that will end up saying about their relationship. Mike pocketed the fake ID for Nacho's father. He's testing what he can get away with saying in front of his boss, and it's rare to see Gus showing signs that the situation is getting to him. With all the darkness that surrounds the coming ending, it's a treat that the show still manages to take time to be extremely funny when it wants to be. The way Jimmy turns things around at the country club is probably where I laughed the most based on the situation they created there. But the whole existence of these Kettleman characters brought it to a similar place in the second episode. Betsy's inability to see that they are actually criminals, or at least to admit as much, will always work for me, and Craig is just the perfect complement. And I mentioned how things were working out pretty flawlessly to this point. Gus is able to plant evidence that Bolsa finds, Lalo is able to buy time by having a body double around, and Jimmy and Kim are thinking ahead and don't seem like they can miss. The thing is that Howard should suspect Jimmy planted these drugs or whatever happens to him. Just a couple of days ago, he confronted Kim at the courthouse, telling her about all the deranged stuff that Jimmy's doing. This leads me to believe that they know Howard will figure this out, and that's all part of their plan. But you also have to expect that all these things that we see getting set up here are going to start falling apart.
¿Qué más queda de decir? ¿Mm? Adiós, hijo. Adiós, papá.
Rockin' Hard Place was a heavy episode where everything happened just how it had to. But even knowing 100% that it couldn't turn out differently, based on the characters that were involved, I was still breathless on the edge of my seat, hoping there might be a way. It was brutal, it was beautiful, it gave us a world-class performance, and it leaves you with a feeling that's hard to shake. The episode opens with a teaser that's set in the desert. You see that there's a storm approaching above, and the camera moves over the ground until it finds its way to a blue flower that it focuses on. The rain starts to fall as you notice a piece of broken glass that tells you that something has happened here. After the opening credits, we catch back up with Nacho, who we last saw fleeing the motel's parking lot in a shot-up truck that didn't get him very far. He leaves that behind, he runs into a nearby field and comes across an old tanker, and with no other options, he decides to get inside. Luckily, there's still a bit of oil inside, so he's able to submerge himself, and he manages to hold his breath long enough to wait out the initial search. This is a great visual representation of what Nacho is going through at the moment, but also what he's been dealing with for the last several seasons. The thought of being covered with oil, it's the kind of thing where you can't just wash that off. And it's like a reflection of his inability to get out of the game or convince his father that they need to run away. The decisions he made before got him into this desperate situation, and now here he is, he has no shelter, no place to hide, no phone, no food, no one to trust. He knows that everyone on both sides wants him dead, and all he can do is wait, inside a can covered with sludge. After dark, he makes his way to an auto mechanic shop to try to rinse himself off. This turns out to be his one break because the middle-aged man that's there doesn't want to get involved. He lets him stay there without asking any questions. He uses his phone, and the first call he wants to make is to his father. There isn't much hope here. He says, "I just wanted to hear your voice," and you believe him. There's nothing either one of these men can say to each other to change the reality of what's happening. His father doesn't know the specifics, but he knows enough to understand that things will never be right unless Nacho gets himself out of this situation. He offers the only advice that makes sense from his perspective. He tells him to go to the police one more time. Nacho knows this isn't an option, and by now that there's no escape. So what else is there left to say? They say goodbye, and the gravity of things really starts to set in. This is tragic because it always seemed like Nacho tried to protect his father in relation to how dangerous his situation was. He knew the only way they could get out would be to run together, and his father wouldn't go for that. He never really presented it in that way. He never put that on him, and instead tried to handle things himself, which is what got him to where he's at in this moment. This call is just a step in accepting the sacrifice he knows he has to make to protect the thing he cares about the most. Then he makes the call that we saw from the other side in episode 2. This time we hear what he's saying to Mike and the proposal that he makes to Gus. He'll come back and forfeit his life in exchange for his father getting away free and clear. A little while later in a warehouse, you see how he gets back into the country. Mike pulls him out of a truck. He gives him some takeout food, and while he's eating, he learns that his life will end tomorrow. They leave it there, and then Victor comes down the stairs. Nacho learns that he looks too pretty to give up his life for Gus's failed attempt on Lalo's. Mike agrees to take care of it, and then he pulls out a bottle to share a last drink with what is essentially a dead man walking. What we know has to happen is inevitable. The choices that set things in motion were made a long time ago. These are two people playing the cards they were dealt, and time is running out for one of them. When Gus arrives at the chicken farm to brief the freshly roughed up Nacho, you get the idea of how things are supposed to play out. He needs to confess his involvement with Alvarez and the Peruvians to Bolsa, but then make a run for it so that Victor can kill him before he's handed over to the Salamancas, which will deprive them of their chance to kill him slow. It's a small consideration, but it's not nothing because I don't even want to think about what they might have done if they were given the chance. Outside, Mike lobbies Gus to let him be there for insurance, not right there, but nearby. And that leaves Nacho by himself, where we see him pour a glass of water and then notice that the glass that Gus broke is still in the garbage can. The next morning, they drop Mike off on the approach to the meeting. And keeping with the inevitability of it all and there not being anything left to say, they just nod to each other as a goodbye. You see that Mike takes up a position to watch how things play out on the same ridge where he was going to kill Hector back in the season 2 finale. When Tyrus tells Nacho to turn around so he can put on the zip tie, you see that he's palmed a piece of glass that he got from Gus's trailer and that we saw on the ground in the opening teaser scene. The van arrives, Bolsa, the cousins, and Hector are all waiting. They bring him out and he tells him, today you're gonna die, but there are good deaths and there are bad deaths, and he gives him a chance to come clean about who hired him. As he's telling him that, you can see the torture implements waiting for him inside. Nacho delivers what he's supposed to say. He fulfills his obligation to Gus and knows that Mike has pledged to protect his father. And then he takes the opportunity to end things on his terms. He tells them that he was being paid for years, but he would have done it for free. He lets the Salamancas know what he thinks of them, and then tells Hector that he's the one that put him in that wheelchair. He uses the piece of glass to get out of the zip tie, grabs Bolsa's gun, and lets the fear of what might happen next sink in for a moment. And then he turns it on himself to end his life his way. It was rough, but a great ending for an amazing character, one that will certainly be missed. This is one of those situations where you know how it's going to play out because these other characters, we know how their stories end, and it still managed to be intense. He wanted it to turn out differently, but he managed to make it a good death, the best possible death he could hope for at that point. And if I ever find myself sucking down Jell-O, I will think of Nacho. And I will come back around to talk about this more at the end. I broke things up this way because I figured Nacho's ending was in the front of everyone's minds, but also because looking at what he was up against, it kind of puts Kim and Jimmy's plans into perspective. And where it was Nacho who saw what Jimmy couldn't back when they first met in season 1, this time it's Huell that points it out. We find Jimmy at home taking a painting down from the wall. This is the same painting we saw coming down the stairs in the episode 1 teaser that I mentioned in my golden toilet video, and we see here how it holds some significance in that pre-Easter egg category that Peter Gould was talking about. On the back, there are a number of post-it notes laying out their plan for taking down Howard. Some of them look familiar. There's a carrot and one for the tour of the country club. And then there are some others saying things like costume, Tuesday 9A, phone call, casting, and Jay Stengel. He moves one that says paint and replaces it with one that says namaste, which is referring to Howard's license plate. From their conversation, you pick up that they were planning on getting a copy of Howard's car to use in their plan, but they're running out of time. In the first of our reminders that Kim is the one who is way more pumped up about this plan, she throws out the idea of using his real car, as in stealing Howard's car. Jimmy is quick to point out the risks that would involve, but then he reconsiders. He brings up something called the valet scam and says it has Huell's name written all over it. The idea of pulling a scam like this off turns things around for him, and you can see that Kim responds to the spark when she kisses him. But so far, I still think he's more going along with things rather than being fully committed. When they get to the courthouse, she passes off a file on one of her clients to ADA Erickson, who's surprised by the gesture because it's something they would have never come up with on their own. She thinks about that, and then she calls after Kim to tell her she has something she wants to show her. In her office, she lays out the Jorge de Guzman file and tells her she knows that this is really Lalo Salamanca. This has all come to light because he was killed in a massive firefight at his compound. Kim does a good job of acting surprised about the revelation and wants to know why she's telling her about it. They go back and forth. Kim reminds her that she called Jimmy a scumbag, and Erickson admits that she has problems with Saul, but she also believes underneath all this showiness, he's a lawyer and a human being, and she thinks he knows what's right. She just described the character in a nutshell, which shows she has some pretty good instincts, only here she's coming to Kim because she thinks she's the more reasonable of the two, which isn't exactly clear at this particular moment in the story. Lalo being dead is actually good news, but it also brings the situation back up when Kim has been so tightly focused on Howard. You see his car pull up at the valet at Fork, a real creature of habit, this guy. As the attendant does his job, you see Huell's plan unfold. In a bump that resembles the beginning of the end of another McGill, he gets a hold of the keys. His guy has to act fast to cut a copy of the key and spoof the electronic fob. It's thrilling to watch as the attendant rushes back to the car, but as you might guess, it all works out in the end. He passes off the device to Jimmy and gets his payment, and before he leaves, he asks if he can ask him a personal question. He can't understand why Jimmy and his wife, with their legit jobs where they do just fine making legit money, would go out and do something like this. Jimmy thinks he isn't able to see the bigger picture. He knows this looks just like a normal scam, but says what they're doing is going to improve a lot of people's lives. It's the story they tell themselves, but it also feels like he's trying to convince himself as much as he's trying to convince the pickpocket in his passenger seat. Huell says if you say so, and the look on his face here mirrors the one that he makes at the end of the next scene. There, Kim is waiting at home, smoking and looking at the sticky notes when he comes in. He tells her Huell came through. Now they have a key. They can unlock and take Howard's car, and she tells him about her conversation with Erickson. She lays it out that Jimmy could break confidentiality and help them with their case, and he asks Kim what she thinks he should do. That's somewhat surprising, and I feel like it's another reminder that he's not completely recovered yet, but Kim's answer is what really blows your mind. Like she's done so many times in this series, she tells him he can make his own decision, but she explains the situation as him having a choice of being a friend of the cartel or a rat, which of course there is some truth to that. He would have to look over his shoulder, even if the ADA kept her word and kept his involvement out of it. But if you think back to like season 2, you would never imagine these words coming out of Kim's mouth. And the way she's presenting it, she's not really giving him a choice. And that's where things are left with them. So wow, we're only at episode 3, and one of the series' big mysteries, what would happen to Nacho, has been addressed. We got what I think was a very good ending, though certainly not a happy one. I suppose the other side of things here is a little less exciting, but there were some interesting bits to ponder with what's happening between Jimmy and Kim, and I believe it made sense to make this episode mostly about Nacho. His situation is really extreme, but I also find it relatable in a detached kind of way, which adds to the connection to the character. And man, you have to give it to Michael Mando. He really brought it in this episode. I think he's always been fantastic. He seems to always come through, no matter what they give him. And here he just solidifies his place as one of the better characters in any TV show over the last 10 years. If you think about the chain of events that happened to get all those characters in that same place, Gus was involved with something in Chile, but manages to make it out. He tries to connect with the cartel, and Hector kills Max on their behalf to teach him a lesson. Nacho gets involved with the Salamancas. He brings Mike in to take care of Tuco after he becomes a problem. That has Mike end up going after Hector because of the Good Samaritan. Gus intervenes there because he doesn't want that to happen. Nacho tries to kill Hector. Gus intervenes again so that he can torture him while using that knowledge to control Nacho. Then he involves him in his plan to try to kill Lalo, and here we are, with Nacho giving up his life to try to protect his father, the one innocent man in this entire equation. Nacho as a character was born from Jimmy's throwaway line in the desert, and they managed to turn that into something. I'm not sure that I can get from where we're at to Jimmy bringing up his name in the desert yet. I think there might be more that has to happen. I mean, obviously something will happen with Lalo, and I think there should be a reason why he says Ignacio in that scene. But as far as who he became, everything that led up to this final scene made sense. I didn't want to see him go, but I liked that he knew that Mike would protect his father. That's a major accomplishment considering what he was up against at the beginning of this episode. And as I mentioned before, he did manage to go out on his own terms. After the last episode, I was wondering how they were going to deal with the idea that Hector knows that Lalo's still alive and is thinking that Gus tried to kill him. I mean, correctly, of course, but that wouldn't have made a lot of sense considering things that we saw later in the story. It felt like at some time that might blow up in his face in relation to the cartel if Hector knew that. I think the way that it played out here, Nacho was able to sell the idea that Gus really wasn't involved with what happened. He turned it all on himself, and it was so satisfying to see him turn things around on the Salamancas before he took himself out. Snatching their chance to make him pay right out from under them, and then having the cousins carry Hector over to fire rounds into his dead body was the perfect way to show that he won. And he still managed to hold on to his honor in a sort of sideways fashion in the strange world they inhabit. It's interesting to think of Mike's journey in relation to Nacho as well. Mike's been on his descent, and Nacho reached out to him when he was first trying to think about how to get out of the life. Mike wouldn't kill anyone at that time, in the game or not, and we've been watching how his code has been changing. Nacho never really became something else, or at least he could never get away either. So this bond they have, even in this dark chapter, is kind of fascinating. At a time, they were kind of moving in different directions, both of them trying to be better, but they still ended up here despite those efforts. On the other side, Kim is focused, and Jimmy's a little harder to pin down. It's still feeling quite difficult to understand why they think they can just keep doing this kind of stuff without Howard figuring out it's them that's doing it. I mean, they're stealing his car. That's set up now. They have the spoof device. They're going to be able to take it. How do they get him to not know it was them? Unless it is all part of their plan, and then that's where things will get interesting. I really like what they did with Huell here, and I like the way that they had Erickson point out what we know to be true about Jimmy, and even offer a path that might pull him back on the right side of things, but then just have Kim shoot that down. Obviously, Jimmy is afraid of the cartel, and he's not going to choose the path of the rat. I mean, it probably would be ill-advised either way, but the offer being there serves as a reminder for Kim and for us that Saul is drifting farther away from the Jimmy we met in season 1.
You're kidding.
I know. How great is that?
This is unbelievable. Are we on a roll or are we on a roll? Jeez.
Let's talk about Better Call Saul Season 6, Episode 4. Hit and Run was a lively one, and it's all fun and games until Mike shows up somewhere out of the blue to tell you something. We definitely shifted away from the heaviness of Episode 3, which makes sense even if it didn't make for the most exciting episode of the season, and that is not a knock on first-time director Ray Seehorn. If I hadn't known who was directing, I would have never guessed that this wasn't done by one of the series' regulars, so great job there. 604 had some fun, some Breaking Bad character returns, and some main characters officially meeting for the first time. No Lalo, but if you're keeping score, Gus has a way cooler tunnel under his house, and hey, he has a decoy too. And at least one long-running theory can be put to bed. Kim will not be getting hooked on meth and will not transform into Wendy. There are transformations happening though. Last week, Kim advocated for stealing Howard's actual car for their plan, and you saw Jimmy getting Huell's help to get inside his car. This week, we see Howard going to a therapy session, and I loved the touch of him unbuttoning his top button to get into the spirit of things after he sits down on the couch. We get a great shot of Jimmy approaching the parking lot in his Howard Hamlin suit from the billboard stunt back in season 1. And I have to agree with Wendy that his hair looks great. The Huell device works, Jimmy's able to get the car, and he leaves a cone to hold the parking spot so he can return it and make it look like nothing happened. This is mostly just fun to watch, but you can't miss how that even though he's stressed, that this whole situation brightens Jimmy up in a way that not much else just does. Kim plays her part by meeting with Cliff Main at an outdoor cafe. You get to see her attention to detail while she's setting things up, and that she has a little bit of nerves as she taps her heel under the table. The plan is for Jimmy to pick up Wendy at the Crossroads Motel and make it look like Howard is throwing her out of his car where Cliff can see it, while Kim pitches him this idea about starting a pro bono practice. That part all goes off perfectly, minus Wendy's root beer. Cliff recognizes the car and Kim plays it off, and it looks like it all happened by chance. Jimmy drives back to return the car. You see him smiling, happily listening to Howard's music now, which he turned off when he first jumped in, and then he finds out that someone moved the cone and took the parking place. He does a quick audible and moves the patients only sign over. He gets it out just in time, and Howard comes back and is none the wiser, and the sign falls over right after he pulls away. So their plan was good and it worked, but as Jimmy warned in the previous episode, there were a lot of ways it could go wrong, and despite all that planning, it almost did. When Kim brings Wendy back to the Crossroads, they notice a car pull up across the street. Wendy thinks it's undercover cops, but then when Kim leaves, she sees that it's following her. Back at their apartment, Jimmy tells Kim the story, and she tells him that Cliff fell for it, that it worked perfectly. She also mentioned that he liked her idea about what she's trying to do, and would probably help her make it happen in some way. Jimmy goes straight to, are we on a roll or are we on a roll? But neither one of them take a moment to consider their plan against Howard. Even when Kim tells him that she thinks she's being followed, Jimmy just tells her to relax because they're the only ones who know what they're doing. To me, this exchange seems significant, and while her meeting with Mike is what everyone will be talking about, there's some interesting stuff developing here before that rearranges things. Here we see Jimmy step up to calm Kim's concerns, much like she did for him in the first couple of episodes. Last week I said Nacho's situation brought what they were doing into perspective, and Huell did a great job of pointing this out, but they're both past the point of being able to stop and reconsider. Kim has evidence that she could probably do what she wanted to do without forcing the Sandpiper settlement, which Jimmy was always eventually going to get that money either way. But after the end of last season, their relationship works in a way that they're way more likely to root each other on than tell the other they've gone too far. And it's pretty amazing how he doesn't show up for the third episode in a row, but Lalo still manages to dominate the rest of this episode. In case you've forgotten, Jimmy McGill never woke up one day and decided to be a friend of the cartel. He never intended to represent Lalo. That happened when he was scooped up on the sidewalk by Nacho, and he wasn't even allowed to bring his mint chocolate chip. The word that he was Salamanca's guy is out now, and it's made him a pariah at the courthouse. But on the streets, he's the lawyer every criminal wants to have on their side. And it was a little sad seeing Jimmy get the cold shoulder from the Beanie Baby clerk and even Bill Oakley. Seeing things turn after all the effort he put in to get people like Hannah Banana to like him. But maybe what's more interesting is how quickly he responds to the attention coming from Spooge and the other characters waiting for him at the nail salon. I guess we always knew that Jimmy wanted people to like him. This was an important part of who he is, but now it's more clear that he doesn't really care where that comes from. If he's to be an outcast in legal circles, then maybe he found his people on the other side of the tracks. While he's hijacking Mrs. Nguyen's cucumber water and racking up a new client list, Kim is meeting with her pro bono clients at the El Camino dining room. Through the window, she notices the car that was following her pull up across the street. And she acts decisively. She just goes over and approaches it. She comes on strong, writing down the license plate and then asking the driver if they're following her. These are Gus and Mike's guys. They're professionals. They don't give up any information and eventually leave when she threatens to call in their plates. As she's finishing up with her last client, we notice that Mike has made his way inside and is now sitting at the bar. He came in after she spotted his guys and makes contact when she's paying her bill. He's cordial, I would say almost friendly as far as Mike goes, and he tells her that he'll answer any questions he can. He assures her that they're not cops, they're not the FBI, and that he's watching anyone that is connected to Lalo. When she brings up the fact that he's dead, he gives her a look to know that he might not be. It's notable that he refers to Jimmy as your husband rather than saying his name, and it dawns on you later as she's putting who he is together that he might be trying to play down how well they know each other. He counsels her to continue to live her life and ignore his guys if she sees them, and eventually they just won't be there anymore. When she asks why he's coming to her instead of Jimmy, he says he thinks she's made of sterner stuff. This is probably about him seeing her stand up to Lalo in episode 509 and his other interactions with Jimmy after their trip through the desert. Obviously, she stepped up to save Jimmy in that interaction with Lalo, and he was listening and he watched it all through his scope. As he's leaving, she realizes where she's seen him before. He worked at the courthouse parking lot, and as he acknowledges that and leaves, Ray Seehorn does this great thing as both an actor and a director, I guess in this case. After she turns back to look terrified at what she just learned, she lets out her breath. It plays like her head was flooded with thoughts to the point of forgetting to breathe momentarily, so that when she exhales, you're right there with the character. Another place where Lalo's presence is being felt even in his absence is over at Gus Fring's house. I didn't mention the way that this episode opened yet. The teaser is a middle-aged couple riding their bikes through their suburban neighborhood. They stop by a house that's getting painted and are distressed by the shade of red that the owner decided to use. They don't seem out of place and are rather stereotypically what you would expect in this neighborhood until they walk into their kitchen and the guys wearing bulletproof vests there seem invisible to them. Next door, you see Gus come inside his place. He lets his fake smile fade as soon as he closes the door, and you see that he's wearing a bulletproof vest and has a gun in an ankle holster while he's getting changed. Carrying a bag of laundry, he goes into his basement, and there you see this elaborate tunnel he has connecting his house to the neighbors. He walks through and passes his body double, his decoy that goes into his house, where we imagine he plays Gus for a few hours. And again, you see these neighbors that just go about their business, pretending not to notice anything he's doing. He goes and sees Mike. They have a conversation. He's a little upset that the guy that Mike put on the inside's 2 years of McDonald's wasn't enough to get him up to Los Pollos standards. Mike complains about them being stretched thin. They're looking everywhere for Lalo, but there's not a thing that's come up. And Gus stresses the idea that Lalo Salamanca is alive. And the question remains, then where is he? Kim meets Jimmy at the location of his future office. We finally arrive at the strip mall. He explains that Mrs. Nguyen kicked him out and that even though it sounds like a bad day, clients are now throwing cash retainers at him. So this kind of mirrors that conversation that they had in the El Camino back in the first episode. She had that tough day with pro bono clients and it was one of the best of her professional life. He had a tough day at the courthouse, but now he's got all these people coming after him and he thinks it's great. She brings up the fact that they're there because of who he represented, and he says that's part of it, but he tries to play it down, and besides, he needs something right away. He's got a lot of clients and nowhere to meet them. What's more, he thinks he can get it month to month, so even though it's small and it's dirty and it has a toilet sitting right in the middle of it, it's temporary, which we all know how that's going to turn out. Here we notice that she's now the distracted one. The Kim that was gung-ho to help craft Saul Goodman earlier seems to be in the background now, and she makes the decision not to tell him about what she found out about Lalo. She doesn't try to dissuade him from taking the office. She says it might be a diamond in the rough, and as they're walking away to get tacos, you see that now it's her who's looking over her shoulder as the episode comes to an end. So this was an episode that had the misfortune of having to follow the final episode of a major character we didn't want to see die. I think it did a pretty good job of that. Not a lot of plot movement, but some interesting character developments and some really funny moments to function as a palate cleanser in between Nacho's darkness and Jimmy and Kim's impending darkness. That feels even more certain to be ushered in by Lalo Salamanca. We may not know what he's been up to since we last saw him, but can all probably agree that it doesn't involve sitting by idly waiting for something to happen. Once the sting of Nacho's death wore off, the reality of how Lalo's plans will certainly overshadow what's going on with Kim and Jimmy started to come into focus for me. I think all the Breaking Bad character returns and references were fun. None of them distracted from what was going on, and they worked to make the shows feel more connected as we get closer to the end of the prequel. I still want Better Call Saul to be Better Call Saul, not Breaking Bad, but they do take place in the same city, in the same universe, and they are getting closer together timeline-wise. Going for tacos at Taco Cabeza was a nice Jesse and Walt reference that you hear the name, you know it, and then you remember that it's from their first junkyard meeting with Tuco. And pre-ATM machine Spooge is a character that we knew was one of Jimmy's clients, so it made sense for him to show up. The strange teaser leading right into the car theft and Wendy's return was a nice transition. At times I get less interested in this sociopath version of Gus that's developed over the past few seasons, but thought it was pretty cool to see inside his house. The way that things are set up, it really makes you wonder how or if he ever unwinds. Like, I know this is his wartime posture, but he has people on the payroll next door that are woven into the fabric of the community. I did appreciate the choice to have them go about their day without acknowledging what was happening around them. It really added some creepiness to an already odd couple, and Gus facing a formidable foe in Lalo, in a true life or death situation, and then still being worried about the workers on the line at Los Pollos was hilarious. With the changing of positions that all seem to further propel Jimmy and Kim into their scheming against Howard, there's some tension surrounding them. When they were on the bed talking about how well everything was working out, it felt like the kind of hubris that comes before a fall. Jimmy finding the strip mall office only leaves the Cadillac and Francesca before he'll superficially be Saul Goodman, and I'm wondering how he's going to get there internally. Kim and Mike sharing a scene was awesome. Now she has to think about Lalo still being out there, and I do wonder about her keeping that to herself to protect Jimmy. I get what Mike was saying and that Jimmy is in fact somewhat broken right now, but are they underestimating him? Kim is super capable and smart, and they make a great team, but this scamming world is Jimmy's domain. Do you think that she would have pulled the sign out of the ground at the parking lot and pulled that off if someone had moved her traffic cone? Plus, her recognizing that this person who saved Jimmy's life in the desert, that he used to work a simple job at the parking lot, has to make her think. It all amounts to me thinking that they're setting things up to get insane.
Because you know.
I know.
You know what's coming next.
It's week 2 of Lalo haunting everyone who's ever met him in our main story. When you try to pull off a big plan, it's important to know your enemy. But what about when your enemy knows you? Howard knows who's behind the latest attempt to destroy his reputation, and Gus knows that Lalo can't move forward with his plan until he has the blessing of the cartel. 2 different worlds, 2 different chess matches, and since this is a prequel, 2 different sets of stakes. This was not my favorite episode of Better Call Saul's final season to sit through, but they are setting up some fascinating maneuvering on both sides of the story. Before this season started, it was hard to imagine Gus losing his cool, let alone breaking under pressure. Now it's hard to imagine a scenario where he doesn't put a definitive end to the threat that is Lalo before this season concludes, because he can't be the character we know from Breaking Bad and still be this worried about him. In Black and Blue, we see him trying to distract himself from the threat by going about his normal business at his restaurant. You see him check his ankle holster before going out front, and then see that he's completely distracted while dealing with a customer. This has all been building up since he knocked over the glass a few episodes ago. And when he goes outside and looks into the distance here, you can see that he's starting to crack. Later, Mike is snuck into his house to tell him that there's still no news and that it's become a waiting game. This not knowing is what is really getting to Gus. His lack of control over the situation. Him using his time to clean the grout in the bathroom with a toothbrush is a great illustration of this. They visit the Super Lab site where Mike reassures him that no one can get inside. Gus then goes and has a look around. He finds a marker on a cord that's laying on the ground and counts off paces to a spot where he stashes a gun. At first, this feels like a backup plan just in case Lalo discovers the lab, but if you think about it, this is probably him taking back some control. He knows that Lalo needs to discover this place as proof to show that he's acting against the cartel. So what if he just uses that against him? And we'll come back around to this at the end after I finish the recap. Kim's attempt to take back control at 3 in the morning is a little less dramatic, but it's coming from the same place. Putting a chair under the door handle is fairly useless, but you have to think of something when you're so worried you can't sleep. Jimmy is lucky in that he still believes Lalo's dead, but he still can't shake off the fear either. He gives Kim the perfect opportunity to let him in on the secret, but she decides that keeping him in the dark is the best course of action. This is interesting since they could be going through this together, and it does make you wonder about her motivation. Is it what Mike said? Is she worried it will break him more? Or is she just concerned with his being able to play his part in their continued assault on Howard? I'm not sure if she knows, just like I'm not sure how she feels about what Viola tells her when they meet up at the El Camino. She starts out there with an apology for how she left Schweikart because she imagines her old assistant had to clean up some of the mess. Then we find out that Viola has been moved from the Mesa Verde account to Sandpiper. When Kim casually mentions she'd heard that too, we understand that this isn't a social visit, that she set the meeting to try to gather some information. She does get some of that. She finds out who the judge on their first mediation session is, and then the conversation turns to how much Viola admires what Kim's doing. Sometimes she questions all of what she does and thinks it's great that Kim could walk away from that to help the little guy. When she says she makes her feel better about the law, Kim gives her a half-hearted smile and takes a sip of her coffee, sort of looking away. It's all a good reminder of what they're risking in trying to push the settlement ahead, and the disconnect between how people see Kim compared to what she's currently doing, and just how unnecessary taking down Howard seems. We get to see him in his glory when he picks up the ball that Aaron fumbled at Sandpiper and runs with it. He's able to convince his clients, the tenants there, who are all getting tired of waiting for this settlement, that it's worth it. And this is impressive, considering their age and the fact that they don't have forever to wait. What's funny is that Cliff had noticed some nervous energy as he was bouncing his leg in his seat before he stood up, and so he takes this moment to confront him about having a drug problem. It gets better when Howard, who can't believe what he's hearing, denies it, but Cliff's been primed by his addict son's lying, so he doesn't believe him. He tells him there's no harm in asking for help, and by this point, Howard has put it all together. In typical Howard fashion, he stops to thank him for his concern since he knows he came to him as a friend and it must have been hard, and then tells him he doesn't have a drug problem, he has a Jimmy McGill problem. He excuses himself to make a phone call and then delivers one of the best Howard lines ever when he tells his secretary to cancel his week. We catch up with Jimmy's continuing transformation into Saul as he fills Francesca in on all the changes that have been going on since he last saw her. Yes, there's no more Kim, and he's standing in the middle of an office that is just one step up from a burnout abandoned building, but he's really busy and willing to double her salary with an additional signing bonus. I love that she drove up listening to a Wilson Phillips song that is 15 years old in the show's timeline, and that she negotiated to have a say in the decorating. That point is curious considering we know what this office ends up looking like, and it makes you wonder because it always seemed like she had been worn down by her time with Saul when we first meet her in the main series. Her quick negotiating skills here seem to be consistent with other instances where we saw her extracting cash from people, so maybe there's more to Francesca than meets the eye. Later that night, she sends Jimmy to a boxing gym to meet a potential new client named Mr. Ward. It turns out to be Howard, who challenges him to a boxing match. This is a meeting that we knew was coming from the trailers, and I honestly never thought that there would be any actual boxing. But there is, and it's an awkward affair, which is kind of why I didn't think it would happen. The way it's shot points out the ridiculousness. Like, there's how it looks in your head when you hand Jimmy a beating, and then there's what it really looks like, which is what we see here, and I guess that's an interesting point to make even if it's not a lot of fun to watch. What's more interesting here is what they say to each other. Of course, Howard was always going to figure out Jimmy was behind this, and he points out that they didn't even try to cover their tracks, which he thinks means that they were trying to get caught. After it's over, he tells him that he's mistaken his kindness for weakness, and that he'd like to think that this would be enough, that this would be the end, but he doesn't believe that's the case. When he goes outside, he meets with his private investigator, telling him that he needs to know everyone that he talks to and everywhere he goes. And when Jimmy leaves, we see him follow him. This brings up a lot of questions because we know that Mike has people following Jimmy that he never noticed. There's potential here that Mike's guys will notice Howard's guys or vice versa, and that their two worlds will come in contact with each other. Kim's waiting at home, and there's a nice shot where she smiles as she watches Jimmy pull up, and then that drops whenever she sees that he's holding ice on his head. Inside, she catches him up on what happened with Viola and shows him a picture of the judge. He makes a remark about liking his handlebar mustache, and that might be a hint that they're going to try to impersonate him. What stood out the most here was that neither one of them was concerned at all about Howard figuring out that they were behind everything that's happened to him. This lines up with my theory that it was part of their plan, and they added a little bit more to think about. At the gym, he had a chance to walk away and just leave Howard unsatisfied, but he chose to go back and take him up on the fight. He makes a point of saying he didn't know what he was thinking, and Kim tells him that he had his reasons. She says it was because he knows what's coming next. And to me, this made it sound like he has guilt over what they're about to do. She grabs his hand to comfort him as they turn out the light. And even though he's become a willing participant, fully on board with making this work, this reinforces that she's still the one pulling the strings. I haven't mentioned the opening teaser yet, and considering what it turned out to be, I'm not at all surprised that I totally misinterpreted what was happening in those scenes from the trailer. It turns out Werner's crew had his slide rule encased in resin or something like that, and gave it to his wife as a gift. We saw him pull this out of his bag in his first appearance when he was looking at the laundry site with Mike. This turns out to be important when Lalo shows up in Germany to track Mrs. Ziegler down. He's back, and he's smooth as ever as he makes the approach and gets information about her husband over drinks. If you watch these scenes out of context, you would have no idea what was going on with this character. He's completely at home in this situation. He coaxes out the cover story, that her husband died in a cave-in, but can't learn more about what they were building because she doesn't know. He nearly seduces her. He does walk her home, but she doesn't invite him in even after he tells her he's flying back tomorrow. He waits all night until he sees her leave for work the next morning, and then sneaks into the house. I don't know about anyone else because this was a tense sequence, but my real fear here was that he was going to kill the dog. They introduced Little Bear when they approached the house, and knowing this character and what he's capable of, it just didn't seem like he was safe. Much to my relief, his charms extend to the animal kingdom, and he's even able to calm this little guy speaking a foreign language. He looks around the house and doesn't find anything useful, and the tension reaches a new level when Marguerite comes back to get her phone. The dog alerts her that something is wrong, and Lalo gets his gun ready as she approaches the steps. While he's considering his options, he sees the slide rule and connects it to what she said about his workers sending keepsakes rather than attending the funeral. The translation of the inscription reads, "With love, your boys," and he notices that the company that made its name is on the bottom. He can use that to find out who commissioned the piece and then go to them for answers about what they were working on. He does one of his super Lalo moves and leaves out of the second floor window, which Frau Ziegler finds open when she comes in that room. If he killed her, it probably would have set off some alarms inside Gus's organization. And since Lalo doesn't know that he thinks he's still alive, this went about as good as he could hope. Little Bear and Marguerite will both live to see another day, and the episode ends as she closes the window, which is the mirror image of the way that the opening teaser started. It was good to get some Lalo, and there's some interesting stuff going on, but as I mentioned at the beginning, this wasn't my favorite episode of the season. It's probably my least favorite. The pacing was similar to last week, but I thought the Wendy caper was a lot funnier than the fight and was more interested in the character development in that one. I think the prequel factor has a lot to do with it. Gus being paranoid is just not that interesting because we know he comes out on top of this situation. The interesting part of that is how he'll manage to pull it off, and of course that does require setup. His going to the lab and taking back some control felt necessary, and it appears that he's putting a plan together. Though I wasn't 100% on what they were going for. When he got distracted at Los Pollos, it was right after he mentioned the signature spice curls, and that made me think of the magical meeting last season when he first introduced those. I guess this was the first step in him putting it together that Lalo would pursue the Germans. Then he can somehow lead him to the site through them. The way he placed the gun, it made it seem like it was part of a plan or a trap even, but it's not clear how he's planning to lure Lalo in yet. The other thing that is starting to wear on me a little is that they're keeping us behind the characters as far as what they're planning. This started with them cutting away from their conversation at the El Camino in the first episode, and now they've planned out this whole operation without letting us in on any of the details. Our being in the dark should make for some good reveals, but it also lessens my investment. Last week when we saw Kim and Jimmy alone, I felt like we were getting insights as to what they were thinking. This week I just kept thinking that I didn't know what they were up to. That said, the Kim and Viola scene was really good. I liked how she was bringing up all this stuff that was in direct conflict with what Kim is actually doing at the moment. And they did manage to develop Howard some in his discovering what they were up to. When I was making my Howard video the other day, I realized just how much we don't know about this character. So it was good to see that they put some layers there, and I'm curious to see how they proceed now that he's actively fighting back. The PI thing seems like it could create real problems, and could even be the thing that brings the two stories together some in Lalo's absence. That does not seem good for Howard, who exists in a place that's a comfortable distance from any cartel activity. I just can't really see how that might be something that would improve his situation.
All right, yeah, I think we found the Zodiac killer.
Well, I'm not keeping my contacts in plain English.
Best quality vacuum.
There was a point in the first 2 episodes of Better Call Saul's final season where it got hard to imagine a way out for Nacho. No matter how much you wanted things to turn out differently, a happy ending was hard to imagine. After the 6th episode this week, I'm starting to feel the same way about Kim. The episode turned out to be the final installment in the setup trilogy that's been unfolding over the past few weeks, and ended with a point-of-no-return moment, a literal U-turn towards a terrible choice, and it feels like there will be consequences. In Axe to Grind, there's a long shot of a young Kim Wexler through the passenger window of her mother's car as it drives away from a close call. Her mother has just told her to relax, you got away with it. But it doesn't look like she's able to do that while she's internalizing what just happened. On the one hand, she was just saved from getting in trouble, and even got to keep the earrings she was trying to steal after her mom re-snatched them on the way out. These are earrings that were instantly recognizable as something she wears as an adult, even to someone like me who doesn't pay a lot of attention to jewelry. On the other hand, as was pointed out in the flashback to Nebraska last season, this is not a happy childhood for the future attorney. Because her past has been a mystery to us, the line that her mom delivers, "I didn't know you had it in you," is an idea that seems to keep emerging in her story. Jimmy didn't think she had it in her to follow through to take down her old boss at HHM. Howard didn't think she had it in her to walk away from Schweikert and Coakley on her own, and is currently oblivious to her involvement in what's happening to him. And as viewers, it would have been hard for us to imagine that she had it in her to turn down this offer she's presented with by Cliff Main in this episode. It makes me want to imagine there's one more "I didn't know you had it in you" that relates to her getting out of this unscathed, but it's getting harder to imagine how that might happen, and we'll definitely be coming back to that. As far as their plan's concerned, while it's never spelled out directly, I do think we can put it together based on what we see in this episode. And as far as their victim, he does still use the kitchen in his lovely looking house, but is currently residing in the guest house along with his wardrobe. He's doing his best to get along with his wife, who we meet for the first time, but their conversation says that things might be worse than we thought from his remarks at the therapist. You watch him craft an amazing-looking cup of coffee that includes a peace sign in the foam, and the way Cheryl dumps it into her travel cup without an acknowledgement or even cleaning up the mess she makes pretty much says it all. She doesn't seem very interested in what he tells her about Jimmy, or very convinced that he'll take care of it, and she doesn't even say goodbye on her way out. It's all pretty harsh, and it all kind of reinforces this idea that he doesn't deserve what's happening, and it'll add to the impact when their plan plays out. At the office, he gets a detailed report of all of Jimmy's comings and goings from his private investigator. The only thing out of place is a trip to the bank to withdraw what looks like $20,000 in cash. Howard believes he's catching Jimmy in the middle of something here, since there's no legal reason for him to be doing that, but we'll get confirmation later that this is all part of their plan, which also includes a trip to see the shady veterinarian Caldera. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that he's shady and a veterinarian, because honestly, he seems to be pretty solid as far as taking care of animals is concerned. They go to him for a drug that will dilate Howard's pupils and presumably make him look coked out during this mediation session for the Sandpiper case. This corresponds with the call that Jimmy has Francesca make later to HHM so that they can get access to listen in. This is the big event, the culmination of their plan that they've taken to calling D-Day. And if it works, Howard's reputation will be called into question in front of all of these important people, and they'll have to settle the case. Caldera assures them that it won't show up in any drug screens, and he seems confident that it's safe. The one thing he mentions that might turn out to be important, though, is that the effect is dependent on the person's tolerance for caffeine. And in the earlier scene where Howard's making the cup of coffee for his wife, you notice that even though they have this really great espresso maker, which he's very good at operating, he actually takes tea. So that might be something to keep in the back of our minds. The vet also mentions that he's on his way out of the business of being the guy you come to when you need something like this, when you need to connect with a criminal. He just needs to sell his black book and then he's leaving town. Jimmy can't believe that he would walk away from this great, nearly passive income stream, but Kim says he knows what he wants, which I guess is her recognizing herself in him, but also we don't actually see how it goes down. But this book does show up inside Saul's house in the episode 1 opening teaser. Also, in case you missed it, Ed the Disappears card is inside and Kim looks at it. We know he'll play an important role in the creation of Gene, but we're going to have to wait to find out how they come to be in possession of the black book and the card. The last part of the plan is to fake some photographs of Saul passing the $20,000 off to an actor who looks like the retired judge who Kim found out was handling the mediation from Viola. They bring in the film students, they put all that together, and everything looks like it's going to go off perfectly until Jimmy goes to buy a celebratory bottle of Zafiro Añejo at the liquor store. There he runs into the actual judge and notices that he has a broken arm. Jimmy thinks they need to abort because now the photographs won't be convincing. And at this stage, Kim should be able to let it go. Because the other thing that happened for her this episode is that deal with Cliff I mentioned earlier. He came to see her in action in one of her pro bono cases. She was making a great argument to get evidence thrown out because the arresting officer used a flimsy excuse for probable cause. And during that, we got what seems to be unrelated reminder of Jeff the cab driver's air freshener from the season 4 Gene scene. After Cliff checked on how she left things with Howard, where she told him that she owes him a lot, he explains there's an opportunity where a major source of funding for justice reform programs is expanding to the Southwest. She would still have to go to a meeting and convince them, but Cliff thinks she's a lock and that she would probably get the funding she needs to do what she wants for her pro bono practice. She's excited. Jimmy is maybe even more excited, and the only catch was that the meeting was happening on D-Day. Jimmy assured her that she didn't need to be there, and this is a ticket to her dream anyway. If this goes through, they don't need the Sandpiper money, and that's why it's hard to understand her decision. She was already on her way when he made the call about the judge having the cast. He gave her the out of saying they should just live to fight another day. And still, after some thought, she says it happens today and makes the turn back to see this plan through. The way it was presented, it doesn't sound like she'll get a second chance at a meeting. And we have to imagine that she thought of this while she was making that decision. If she keeps going, she gets what she wants by doing the right thing. And I describe this as a point of no return because this was her chance to go the other way. If she just keeps driving, she's got a promising career doing good for the less fortunate, and even if that falls through, she's got a husband that loves her and is supportive. When she makes the turn, she's putting all of that at risk and putting everything she has into pulling off this scam to basically get the same things, only in this version, Howard looks ridiculous. It's frustrating, but it's also fascinating. It's hard to watch, but I can't look away. In the video I did about their motivations, I touched on the idea of her being driven by something deeper. To play with the episode's title, she definitely has an axe to grind. I don't know that the opening sequence clears that up. It does add another layer, and of course people are complicated. I feel like it makes some sense about why she's drawn to Jimmy, and how she handled situations in earlier seasons. More than anything though, it just makes it feel like we're at the place where it's all or nothing. And I don't know what will happen next, but won't likely stop thinking about it until we find out. There were also some other things that happened in this episode. Francesca went wild decorating the strip mall office. She's got a flair for a vibe that's professional and refined and, inviting. It's funny that there's probably a connection to the way both the furnishings and her disposition changed to match what they're like in Breaking Bad. We didn't get any Gus sightings in this episode, which might be related to the fact that Giancarlo Esposito did a pretty good job directing it, but we did get some time with Mike. He got a call about using resources to protect Stacy and Kaylee, and made it clear that he wouldn't be backing down from that when he talked to Tyrus. This might have been a little superfluous, but I thought it worked pretty well. It pointed out how difficult this situation is. This is across the board for Gus's whole organization, more or less, and also to show how dedicated Mike is. And I thought that made sense considering the last thing we have to talk about showed how dedicated Lalo is. He's still in Germany. He made his way to the remote house that Casper's living in. He found out where that was by going to talk to the people who made the slide rule memorial for him. In case you forgot, he was the worker who told Mike that Werner was worth 50 of him before he returned to Germany. He wasn't expecting any visitors and decides to run and hide whenever he sees this man come into his backyard through the forest. That part of his plan wasn't all that bad. He does end up getting the jump on his pursuer when he follows him inside a barn. The only problem was that he decided to hit him with the back of his axe instead of just killing him. Unfortunately, Lalo isn't the kind of guy you want to have a conversation with under these circumstances. And after Tony Dalton does a really great job of convincing me he can barely breathe, he uses a concealed razor to slash Casper, then takes the opportunity to use his axe to cut off his foot. Lalo gives him his belt to stop the bleeding so he can ask him what Gus was building, and then I imagine he'll put him out of his misery before he leaves. And with that, we've made it through the setup, and now we'll get to see if the payoff was worth it. I like this episode a lot better than last week's. It was mostly the same, but we were able to put together what was happening with the plan. Last week it seemed like they were teasing us a little bit, not really giving us details, and this time they didn't come out and tell us, but they gave us everything we needed to put it together. They're going to use the PI, who I'm not sure is in on this or not, but he's giving Howard this information, and they let him think that he found something. So when he sees these photographs, he's going to think that Jimmy's trying to bribe the judge, and after they give him the drug to make it look like he's really high, he's going to make a baseless allegation. Jimmy will be able to call in and listen to it all go down, and it did seem like if it plays out that way, it would work. I really enjoyed the flashback and thought it was impressive how much they managed to flesh things out in that 5-minute sequence. The actors who play young Kim and her mom do a fantastic job of resembling Ray Seehorn and matching some of her mannerisms. And the little touches like her nervously bouncing her foot and still wearing those earrings are fun. It's also interesting to compare this to season 5's flashback. In that, Kim wouldn't take the ride home with her mom, who was late because she'd been drinking. She was willing to walk miles carrying a cello to stand by her principles. In this one, she's showing that she does indeed have it in her, and also that she's willing to accept her mother's help when she needs it, and possibly because she wants something. She can be surprising, and that's something we've seen in small moments throughout the series. The show's been about Jimmy McGill transforming into Saul Goodman, and since it's a prequel to Breaking Bad and we know him in that show, it's natural to make comparisons between his transformation and Walter White's. Now you can't help but think of making the same comparisons with Kim. There's the idea of, did situations that came up create the character, or did it cause who they really are to come out? And when you look at all three, I think you come up with different answers. I thought the D-Day and Omaha Beach references were pretty interesting too. That was a successful mission, but a lot of soldiers lost their lives in service of that. I think it's safe to say that there's going to be casualties with their plan as well, and if Kim and Jimmy are worried about that, they probably should have chose a different name. There was a lot of good Breaking Bad references here, and it was nice to see Caldera come back. I thought it looked really good, and I thought there was some great editing in this one. I really liked the cut from Jimmy and Kim celebrating, to Casper's axe chopping wood, and then to the laundry from Jimmy holding the client who was peeing in his water feature. The mid-season finale is next. It genuinely feels like things won't be the same after this next episode, and I think that that's probably a good place to leave things.
Can't rush the process.
As long as there's an image, it doesn't have to be perfect.
Can't rush the process.
There's a moment in Better Call Saul Season 6, Episode 7, where Lalo sees a cockroach crawling by. It reminds him of his lawyer, who he once compared to the resilient and enduring insect. And it's reminiscent of Gus figuring out how Lalo might get to him when he thought of those spice curls. There's small details that can slip right by when they're first introduced, but jump out when you're looking back trying to put together what you just watched happen. Within the story, the characters experience something similar. By the end of the mediation meeting, Howard knows exactly how he was conned, just like Chuck knew precisely what happened with the Mesa Verde paperwork back in Season 2. But the schemes they were up against were so well crafted that there wouldn't be anything they could do about it by the time they figured out what was happening. They get sucked in like we get swept up, and this episode got me really excited about how the writers may have put together the ending of this story. For my money, this is a nearly perfect episode of television. It started out with the big surprise that Lalo is already in Albuquerque. We watch his plan develop at his cool and deliberate pace, and we pick up with Jimmy and Kim, who are in a frantic race against the clock. These stories might be happening in the same city, but they couldn't feel further apart. And everything on Kim and Jimmy's side hinges on a character who couldn't be further removed from the world that Lalo and Gus inhabit. Different characters, different factions, and different plans, but everyone does have one thing in common. They all think they know what's going on and that they can control the situation. This is highlighted beautifully in an early scene where Howard startles a new hire who is there to stock the refrigerator. While we're all thinking, hey buddy, don't put those cans you just shook up in with the others, Howard calmly shows him how to solve his problem. What's more, he learned the technique from the M in HHM, Charles McGill. The fresh lawyer has no idea who Chuck is a year and a half after his death, at least not from seeing his image, and that makes you think about the legacy of the man who built the firm into what it is, which plays as some uneasy foreshadowing of what's to come for Howard. Chuck knew Jimmy so well, he couldn't imagine anything going wrong right up until the second it did. Hamlin doesn't believe he could make the same mistake, but ultimately he will. As far as D-Day is concerned, the deck is stacked against Howard in a way he wouldn't have been able to anticipate. The private investigator he hired was indeed a plant from Kim and Jimmy the whole time. This was something that started to become apparent in the last episode, but there was the issue of not being able to figure out how they would have got him to hire the exact PI they needed him to. It turns out they knew which agency HHM uses for matters like this, and so they called the receptionist, telling her they needed to update their contact information. The new number went straight to a burner phone held by the PI Jimmy and Kim hired, and when Howard reached out, he dealt with him directly. This means he never had a chance, and to their credit, Jimmy and Kim's plan works perfectly. First, they have to reshoot the pictures, which is so much fun and so kinetic that you almost forget about that Lalo teaser. Jimmy goes to convince Lenny to walk off his shift and gets some clutch performances from the UNM film students to recreate the bribe photographs, with the fake judge wearing a fake cast. The photo shoot starts out with this great long sequence that plays like a oneer, where things wind up tighter and tighter until it ends on a shot of Kim wrapping the faux cast. There's a couple of small details here that lighten things up. The makeup girl is coming from rehearsal for a live-action musical tribute to the Dark Crystal. And if you're wondering why the sound guy brings his boom mic to photo shoots, well, someone has to make it look like the shots were taken from behind some cover. It's notable that when Kim shows up, she refuses to head back to Santa Fe for her meeting when Jimmy suggests it. Helping those pro bono clients is a distant memory in the midst of the unfolding plan. And later, Howard will finally lay out what's really behind all of this. Sure, they will get money, and it will be enough for her to start her practice, but they're really doing this for fun. This has never been as clear as it is when they listen in on the meeting. The satisfaction of hearing Howard's demise literally turns them on to where they're grinding on the couch before it's over. And as mentioned, it does go off superbly. The topical solution on the pictures gets into Howard's bloodstream as he thinks he's being shown evidence of a bribe. He doesn't know who's in the pictures until the judge walks into the meeting. He makes his accusation thinking he can back it up, only to have different pictures of Jimmy handing the sound guy who's wearing the handlebar mustache his frisbee. It's laugh out loud funny, while being devastating at the exact same time. It doesn't matter that he puts it all together, if Cliff believes him or not, or whether Rich Schweikert is disappointed about how it happened. His firm has to move to pressure to settle, and Cliff has to threaten Howard to agree because there just isn't another option. I really liked how they ended this, for all the fun there was in the lead up, and how perfectly they paid off all the setup. The judge's reaction and Rich's conversation with Cliff paint a great picture of how it looks from our perspective. There's no sense of victory, no hooting, no hollering. There's no dramatic moment with Howard nosediving off the roof or anything like that. It's just an absolutely uncomfortable display from the Golden Boy, and we've already peeked behind the curtains to know who was responsible. No matter how you feel about Howard's character, you can't help but feel sad for him in that moment. It only gets worse from there. Lalo has been spending his time watching the laundry company where Gus is building the super lab. He found out where that was from Casper, and he makes a recording for Don Eladio, revealing that he's still alive and letting him know what Gus is up to. His plan is to kill the guards and go inside to get that proof he's been after, but when he calls Hector, he realizes that he just gave himself away when he hears that the phone line is being monitored. This is the rare occasion where we see him lose his cool, but he recovers quickly after smashing his folding chair. He calls back and to Hector's dismay tells him he couldn't find proof, but will move against Gus that night anyway. This is misdirection, and he's able to see the security detail react in real time. It's not clear if he anticipated that they were watching Jimmy's apartment and wanted to draw people away from there, but that's what ends up happening. When Mike goes to warn Gus, he mentions that they pulled everyone off of the low priority targets. Their plan is to use Gus's two-house setup to their advantage. Put him in the couple's house next door, use the decoy to make it look like he's in his house alone, and then take Lalo out when he makes his move. We'll have to wait and see how that all plays out, if it even comes to that, because he's got another stop to make after seeing that cockroach. Kim and Jimmy are watching classic movies waiting for Howard to show up. When the knock at the door happened, I half expected it to be Lalo, which provided an unexpected sense of relief when it turned out to be Howard. As Jimmy opens the door, you can't help but notice that Kim reacts to the flicker of the candle that's sitting on the table. Howard comes in, and there's a little bit of Kim and Jimmy acting like they don't know what he's talking about, which he quickly points out that of course they have to play it that way. And then the scene transcends whatever you thought it might have been when Howard poses the question everyone who watches the show has been asking. What did he do to deserve this? He then very succinctly runs through all the reasons that we know about, which made me chuckle on a personal level since they were all the things I listed in my video a few weeks ago. It still doesn't quite make sense. And as Patrick Fabian, who's always been fantastic in the role, takes things up to another level that we've never seen, he puts it out there that they do it for fun, that they get off on it. He reveals what he really thinks about both of them. He agrees with Chuck that Jimmy can't help himself. He was born broken and will never be different. He says that he thinks Kim is one of the smartest and most promising human beings he's ever known, so he can't believe the choices she's made. There's a point here where he tells her that she has a piece missing, and it feels like one of those situations where someone tells you something that you know to be true, but aren't willing to look at. It's a telling exchange that complicates things more than it clears them up. We know that he has changed to become a better person over the past few seasons, but he's being honest in the way that he looks at people because he doesn't have anything else to lose. It's the part where Howard gets to be right while still displaying all the ugly parts of his character. He is all the things they think he is, but there is more to him. In this episode, we've seen the good alongside the bad, and Jimmy and Kim are all the things Howard thinks they are. Although the sociopath allegation is a little dramatic, but there's more to them as well, and they did plan things out in a way that could have worked. There's a moment where they've clearly won, and it's still true that he'll be able to bounce back, that he'll land on his feet, and he acknowledges this. And we see some of their humanity when they react to the news that his marriage is falling apart. It's not that they didn't plan things out or even ignore the potential for consequences. It comes down to them not having as much control over things as they thought they did. The same thing they planned out to happen to Howard happens to them, and no amount of planning could have accounted for the situation they find themselves in when the candle flickers again. Right before that happens, Howard vows to dedicate his life to making sure everyone knows the truth, and I suppose that's a vow he's able to keep. Lalo enters the room, and Ray Seehorn and Bob Odenkirk match Patrick Fabian's incredible performance when they realize what's happening. The look of terror is so authentic, and you have to imagine for Jimmy, this is like seeing a ghost. They try to get Howard to leave, but he's just getting started, and Tony Dalton sells the idea that he has nothing to worry about, even while he's putting the silencer on his gun. What follows is a death that is absolutely shocking, even though you knew it was going to happen. It takes the idea of Howard doesn't deserve this to a brand new place. His brains are splattered on the painting that they used to plan out his downfall, and after he hits the ground, Lalo quiets them down and says, "Let's talk." There will be consequences. It's hard to say what those will be, and it's hard to know what Lalo has in mind for these two that brought him over here in the first place. To me, it seemed like Lalo might have been surprised when he saw Mike come out of the laundry and how quick the response was. Maybe just how many people are around in general. It's possible that his mistake tipped him off that things were more dangerous than he was expecting. I also don't know how they'll explain him never sending the videotape to Eladio, but maybe it will be about him changing up his plans. Maybe this is all related. I don't know how Jimmy and Kim fit into his plans, but it can't be good for either of them. We know what the consequences are for Howard. He's dead. What's worse is that he'll disappear with his legacy wiped away, thanks to this drug addiction narrative that Jimmy and Kim so carefully crafted. He was the last of HHM standing, so you have to imagine that that will cease to exist. The final sequence is similar to Drew Sharp's murder in Breaking Bad. The crazy plan works out, but someone finds themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. I'd say it has the same impact. I'll also say again that it doesn't matter if you like the character, or even if you were happy to see him knocked down earlier in the episode. No one deserves what happens to him here. And Jimmy and Kim will be connected to this since they saw it happen and won't be able to say anything about it. So just a great episode. It does all the things that you expect Better Call Saul to do well. It looked great, the performances were stellar, and it found a balance between the funny and the dramatic. There were so many little things in this episode that stand out that are in some ways overshadowed by this crazy ending. What's more promising is the way they brought things together. Plan and execution addressed so many things we'd been thinking about in the last 3 episodes and delivered a confident payoff. It's also able to deliver what you think might happen with a little bit of misdirection, like Howard not drinking caffeine to keep it from being completely obvious. Plus, it manages to make the outcome that makes the most sense still feel exciting, which I guess is really important when you're making a prequel. It was all really satisfying. Little things like the PI being in on it, which was on the board to see if you go back and look, and big things like how will this plan go wrong and what will the unintended consequences be. At the beginning of the season, we had 4 characters whose endings we weren't sure about. So far, Nacho and Howard's stories both came to memorable ends, and we still have 2 to go. I feel like my confidence for how those will end is at an all-time high, regardless of which direction they decide to go in.
Clear on the south.
All right, hold the perimeter. Everyone else on me, eyes sharp. Nice and easy. We don't want to spook the neighbors.
Point and Shoot once again drove home the idea that actions have consequences, and it tied up a lot so that they can get around to answering the big questions. We do pick up right where the last episode ended. Like candles still exactly the same size, fresh blood still streaming down the wall, and mid-freakout watching Howard's blood pool at our feet right where we left off. We don't get there until after we have an ominous teaser that starts off as a beautiful shot of a beach that slowly reveals that it's anything but. By the time you see the Namaste plate, it's probably already come together that this is a flash forward showing what the cover story of Howard's disappearance looks like. Lalo has a plan, and he's going to need Jimmy and Kim to focus so he can explain it. What I love about this plan is that when you first hear it, it sounds a little flimsy. Why would Lalo leave the crucial part of his plan against his arch enemy up to these 2 inexperienced, cowering civilians? The answer doesn't come until later, but it's so satisfying when you finally put it together. What he tells them is he wants Jimmy to get in his car and drive over to someone's house and shoot them. There's a reliable, idiot-proof revolver in the glove box, and all they have to do is point and shoot. It'll be no problem at all because this guy is a house cat. He almost looks like a librarian, but don't be fooled because even a house cat can scratch. With the hard part out of the way, just take out the camera and do the exact same thing, point and shoot. In what initially seems like a puzzling turn, Jimmy tells Lalo that he needs to send Kim. And I suppose this is as good a place as any to point out the incredible performances these actors deliver. Bob Odenkirk sells that he's stunned while he shifts into survival mode. Ray Seehorn had me sort of sympathy shaking along while her character is absorbing the reality of the situation, and Tony Dalton delivers one more example of the adaptability that exists right next to his menacing core. For my money, the brilliance of this scene is in Jimmy's decision. Of course, no one watching was thinking they should send Kim. It even takes annoying Lalo to the point where he just agrees to shut them up. If Jimmy were to go, he would have to do exactly what Lalo wanted because Kim's life would be at stake. By sending her, he's at least opening up possibilities. And I think this hits home when he looks her in the eyes and tells her that she has to go. I believe at that moment, Jimmy has to accept that this might be the last time he ever sees her, that he might be sacrificing himself so she has a chance to live. And wow, bravo Gordon Smith. Talk about putting a character in a situation where they have to make a tough but ultimately correct decision. After being reminded that she'll need her shoes, Kim does follow the plan like a person who is trapped inside a nightmare that they can't wake up from. There's a great shot where she's sitting at a light and a police car pulls up next to her with its window rolled down, which presents her with an out. Because she doesn't take it, it proves her dedication to doing what she has to do to get back to her husband, who we now know has been tied up and left behind as Lalo puts the next step of his plan in motion. Sending someone to Gus's house was only part of what he had in mind. I'm sure he'd be happy if they were able to kill him, but ultimately it doesn't matter. What he's counting on is a diversion that would pull his guys away from the super lab. And from there, things play out like you'd think they would if you've been paying attention. Kim is intercepted at the door and pulled into the house by Mike. He learns that Lalo sent her and is at their apartment right now. That has him pull Tyrus from the laundry and send him there. And that presents the opportunity for Lalo, who's waiting out front, to get inside and find the lab. Gus decides to call and ask him some questions, and the idea that they were able to talk Lalo out of sending Jimmy sets off an internal alarm. That doesn't sound like the Lalo he knows, and he starts to realize that this is all just a diversion. From there, he heads to the lab and the showdown is on. I've been convinced that Lalo would have to die before Better Call Saul came to an end, and that left me wondering how they could make that seem satisfying. Especially as it started to seem more and more likely that it would happen with the gun at the lab. The answer to that comes in the most obvious way. You just put these two amazing characters in a room together and let them taunt each other. From Lalo's perspective, he has the upper hand and will finally get what he came for. He relishes the impending victory by talking into a camera for Don Eladio's benefit. But the Chicken Man has his backup plan ready to go, and he has his own words for their boss before he springs into action. This somewhat brief exchange brings back so much of the character's histories. From the moment he was introduced in the series, everything he's done has brought Lalo to this place with the sole purpose of taking down Fring. Gus has been playing the long game of exacting his revenge, and he even gets to explain it out loud to Lalo before he turns the tables. And I would give him extra points for calling Eladio a greasy, bloated pimp. We had seen him set the stage back in episode 5. He can cut the lights with the extension cord and knows exactly where his idiot-proof revolver is hiding in the dark. He turns out to be the one to point and shoot and not stop until it's empty, and he is able to hit his target. The obvious problem with killing off a character like this is that you don't get any more Tony Dalton. But since he did have to go, I think they did the character justice. Gus is able to pull himself together enough to stand over him to witness his last moments, and watches as Eduardo Lalo Salamanca dies laughing. The episode doesn't end there, though. Remember, I mentioned consequences at the beginning, and they set those up before we cut away. I thought it was a great choice to start this off with Lyle, who's the kind of guy who goes in early to open singing the jingle of the place where he works. He learns that he's going to have to open and close 2 days in a row. Gus tells him that it's because he was called out of town, but it's really because he took a couple of bullets in that shootout. Jimmy and Kim are reunited when Mike brings her home. Neither are unaffected by what they just went through, but they are both safe for the time being. Mike and his guys will take care of cleaning up Howard's body, but they're going to have to jump right back into their lives as if nothing happened. And you can see that this is something both characters would understand intellectually, that it's necessary. But as viewers, we know that this is easier said than done. They may have the Sandpiper settlement coming in, but how do they go back to enjoying their takeout in the same room where they saw Howard bleed out? Back at the lab, they dig a grave to bury these two characters together. You can see that Mike has feelings about Howard ending up there because he was definitely not in the game, as he removes his wallet, wedding ring, and shoes to tie back into the cold open. Ending the episode by burying them together is certainly a way to answer the question of how the cartel and lawyer sides of the story would eventually come together. Now when you watch Breaking Bad, it'll be hard not to think of them when you see the super lab. Lalo certainly got what was coming to him, but at least he got a payoff for all this time looking into Gus. He got confirmation that he was right about his suspicions. And as I alluded to earlier, Gus does put him in his place. He even spells it out for him, essentially saying, look, I'm smarter than all of you guys. That's why I'm doing this. You're all terrible. You're just like jackals. And you can almost imagine Lalo having a respect for this person who is taking him down. On the other hand, Howard just played the game and lost. And what's worse is that he'll be remembered as a drug addict that killed himself thanks to these two worlds colliding. It's a dark way to end things for him, and it makes you wonder how bad things might get for the ones who managed to make it out alive. Because the idea of Kim dying is not one that I've ever thought was going to happen, but it really looks like it's not going to happen after this. At the end of the day, there are a lot of things that are working out exactly as they were planned. But then something else comes along and well, then that happens too. It's all about the aftermath now and what comes next. And with 5 episodes to go, it's kind of exciting to not know for sure what will happen. I don't think this episode was quite as good as the previous one, but it did do a fantastic job of wrapping up the inevitable parts of the story. It's a little bit surprising that they killed Lalo off with so many episodes left, but just as was the case with Nacho, it makes perfect sense now that I've seen it. With the big question of how Lalo dies out of the way, we can focus on what happens between Jimmy and Kim, and there's still half of a regular season left for them to get into that. We watch them both reinforce their dedication to each other in this episode, and that makes it a little harder to see where their split happens. Jimmy made the choice to sacrifice himself by sending Kim, and I imagine part of him was hoping that she would just keep going. I doubt he thought she would ever pull the trigger. I certainly didn't think she would, even as she was ringing the doorbell. I suppose the question is whether she thought she would do it, and I don't think they make that clear. What you see is someone who knows she has an hour to get back to her husband, taking each step as it's presented to her. Right after she left, I was thinking about how would she react to this decision, that Jimmy's sending her out to do this dirty work, but by the end I think it's clear that she's worked that out in her head, that it was the right decision. Either way, we never saw her falter, and the hug when they're reunited is almost unnecessary to show how they feel about each other. The real problem is what living with this situation will do to them. I thought Jimmy catching that glimpse of them putting Howard's body in the refrigerator was a nice way to emphasize this. Sort of like, hey, look, it's not all bad. At least you got a new refrigerator out of the deal. It reinforces this idea I've had that the Saul routine in Breaking Bad is just a coping response from all this stuff that he's going through. And that means the big question is, how will Kim handle it? This was Gordon Smith's final writing credit for the season. It was another great job to follow up Rock and Hard Place. Kind of interesting that he crafted fitting endings for both of the characters that came about from Saul's line in the desert. I think since the big events were mostly expected, where the writing excels here is in the details. Even though it was super dark, they managed to slip in some funny moments to keep things a little lighter. I liked seeing Lalo put the gag on Jimmy as he was saying it wasn't me, it was Ignacio, as a wink and a nod to the fact that we've been discussing that line forever. And I don't know why exactly, but I thought it was hilarious when Kim pointed to the fake Gus in that scene. There were a lot of great references and a lot of shots that mirrored things we'd seen before. Off the top of my head, Jimmy tied up looking at Howard reminded me of Walter and Ozymandias. Mike coming in to clean up Jimmy and Kim's apartment reminded me of his first appearance at Jane's apartment. Lalo meeting his end through the object of his revenge reminded me of Hector and Gus's next face-off. And there are just too many more to name. Since Vince Gilligan directed this episode, I don't have to point out that it was visually stunning, but I wanted to take a second to appreciate the use of the teaser. This is something that has become so common that it's almost hard to remember how much these added to the experience of watching Breaking Bad for the first time. This one reminded me of that, and all of the great ones that came before it. Starting off with this beautiful shot that catches your attention, and then watching it shift to becoming a lot more unsettling. It's something that a lot of other shows have tried to recreate, and you'd be hard-pressed to come up with someone who does it better. It's all got me super excited to see where this thing goes next, and I think that's a great place to leave things.
I never saw it coming. End of an era.
Yeah.
What seems like years ago now, showrunner Peter Gould promised viewers that the final season of Better Call Saul would change the way we saw Breaking Bad forever. I never doubted him for a minute, because why would I? This team has pretty consistently earned my trust, but I also didn't expect how thorough of a job they were setting out to do. A couple hours after finishing Fun and Games, my head is still spinning while I connect the dots. I didn't love what happened in this episode, but I did love how it happened. I loved the way it was set up, I loved watching the characters go through it, and I suppose most importantly, I loved the absolute and unconditional clean break. Can I pull out a much maligned Bravo Vince here? Because one of the other favorite responses in relation to the show, which would bring you an equal amount of vitriol, was to ponder if any certain thing that he did was the moment Jimmy McGill turned into Saul Goodman. And then they just did it. They paired it with one of the most expert time jump edits I've ever seen, and then it was done. Hi there, Saul Goodman, nice to meet you. It's all fun and games until someone gets hurt. The thing this show has done better than anything that came before it is to deliver the inevitable in a way that's still thrilling to watch. We know where things are going, and we'd rather craft elaborate theories that would explain how it might turn out differently, rather than accept what we're about to see. We know that Jimmy and Saul exist inside the same person, but don't want to see him change. We know Kim has to leave him for that to happen, but would rather she'd stay. We believe Mike is different than his cohorts, but don't see as much of that in Breaking Bad, and I could go on. They made us want things to be different, while never not telling us exactly how they'd be. This episode's ending actually begins in the last one, when Lalo and Howard are buried together under the future super lab. There are some obvious takeaways built into that scene. It's a visual representation of the two sides of the story coming together. There's a lawyer laying next to the cartel. It's awful that Howard ends up that way, buried next to his killer nonetheless. And you can't miss Mike's regret as he tells his guys to take it easy with the body. We know Mike's discomfort is about Howard not being in the game. It doesn't fit with the code that he's crafted to help make his working with Gus make sense. The other layer here is that no code can account for the world of destruction that what they do brings. People make choices for what seem like good reasons. Mike wants to provide for his daughter-in-law and his granddaughter because he can't forgive himself for not being able to protect his son. He copes with what he believes he has to do by trying to dictate how far he'd go while he's pursuing that. But in a way, he's just lying to himself. Fast forward to him trying to do the right thing by going to visit Manuel Varga and tell him about his son Nacho, someone who by the end Mike truly cared for. When he tells him that he fell in with some bad people, but was never like them, not really, he had a heart, he's basically describing what he thinks about himself. Papa Varga is able to deliver a truth that Mike can see but not accept. There is no justice in killing Nacho's killers because it's just about revenge. It doesn't change what happened, and what's worse is that it doesn't deliver resolution. The next thing leads to the next thing, and it never ends. I believe it's likely that the better part of Mike understands this, and that means that in Breaking Bad, he's making a conscious decision to overlook that. It's a hell of a way to bring his Better Call Saul story to an end. We know where his story goes from here, and this moment with Manuel will paint a lot of his choices in a different light. This is something that I'll come back around to, but if we're talking about revenge, we might as well talk about what his boss was up to in this episode. Gus is summoned for a quick trip to Mexico where he crushes Hector one more time. As Bolsa was reading his letter, I found myself wondering just how long it would take for him to dictate that to the cousins, and to compare that to how long Eladio took to dismiss it in favor of his top earner. Lalo did such a good job of setting up his fake death that he made his uncle look like a delusional, jealous crank that wasn't getting his way. Hector isn't the type of character that you feel bad for. After all, he relished killing Max in front of Gus a few feet away from where they are, but you do still feel something as the sound of his ringing bell fades as he's carried away. Gus defeated Lalo and he got away with it. We see that start to set in, and we see him do something we've never seen before. He goes out to celebrate. He has a pleasant, uplifting conversation about fine wine that's packed with sexual tension, and it's a complete reversal from the paranoia he's been living with throughout this season. He has the money bottle of wine at home that's just waiting to be shared, and he does allow himself to entertain that fantasy. Only for a minute though. Before his friend returns, he pays up and leaves. And that felt like the conclusion of his involvement in this prequel. We know how single-minded his purpose is. We know where that takes him. And as much as this show did to make him a little scarier, a little more sociopathic, I feel like this made his character a little more sad. He'll give up everything else to get what he wants, and he'll be successful in making the cartel and the Salamanca family pay, and just like this potentially hot romance here, he'll never get to enjoy it. In relation to their plan against Howard, Kim and Jimmy also got what they wanted. They made him look bad, and they got away with it. But their victory came with a very real unintended consequence that led to him being in that hole at the end of episode 8. In the season's first montage, we watch as they're more or less able to go back to their lives in the wake of that disaster, as Mike and his guys make their apartment look like it never happened. After they come home, they briefly move into a hotel that happens to have the same painting above the bed that Walt commented on when he first met Uncle Jack. And when Jimmy parrots Mike's advice from last season that he got from Stacy and their group back in season 3, there's a sense that they may be able to put the whole thing behind them. It's not until they return to HHM that we get to take their temperatures, and it turns out they're ice cold. On the way in, Jimmy says they can get through 20 minutes of anything. And based on a Reddit comment I saw, I went back and checked, and if you skip ahead 20 minutes from where he says that, you'll see Saul in a silk robe managing his comb over in the mirror. Howard's memorial is a high-stress affair. Presumably everyone who knew and loved him is there. I feel like the actor who played Ernesto must not have been available for this, because this would have been the perfect time to show that he's moved on and is thriving after his situation with Chuck. We do get a final scene with Rich Schweikart, and it's funny in a way that they have all these mounted pictures around that look like they could be from Patrick Fabian's personal Instagram account. Things get heavy when they go to pay their respects to his wife, Cheryl. She brings up that her husband told her that Jimmy was harassing him, which we saw Howard do in her brief appearance back in episode 6. It's not a surprise that Jimmy can deflect the accusations while appearing to be earnest and respectful. He knocks it out of the park just like you'd expect. Still, Cheryl can't believe Howard was on drugs and starts to get upset. This creates a situation where Kim has to step up with a lie that goes above and beyond. She comes up with exactly what's needed, while at the same time, it's something you'd never want this character to be involved with. She doesn't just make up a story that never happened, which ends up being corroborated by Cliff's inability to answer, which of course is related to their scam, but when Cheryl starts to believe it, she leans in to pretend she's on her side, and well, that's difficult to watch. And I think what's worse than the aftermath of what their choices have led to, all of this that's happening in these last couple of episodes, what's worse is that they're just so damn good at doing this. As they go out to the parking garage, we get a glimpse of the spot where we first saw them interact in that famous scene in the first episode of the series, and then Jimmy tries to put a positive spin on things. Then we get what I think is the best Ray Seehorn as Kim scene in the entire series. I know, recency bias, but in this shot where she doesn't say anything, where she just looks at her husband and contemplates what he just said before she moves closer to kiss him, I knew that it was over. It takes a second to hit, but it feels impossible to miss. Not to be outdone, Bob Odenkirk does a fantastic job of letting us see that Jimmy knows it too after she drives away, even if he's not ready to accept it. Because we're not ready to either, they give us a courtroom scene to drive it home ever so slowly. By the time the judge has just about had it with her not wanting to move forward with her current case, Kim admits that she's no longer a lawyer. At first, I was confused about why she made this step. If you don't want to practice, fine. But why make it official? I think this comes back to the idea of justice that we heard Papa Varga bring up. Part of this quest to take down Howard was born in the belief that Kim could decide who deserves it. What's a career setback for a powerful lawyer in comparison to all the help that she could give to underprivileged people? And she wasn't necessarily wrong, all things considered. Tipping the scales in the other direction would amount to some good. And even Howard realized that he would bounce back before he died. I think she realized the part that Manuel pointed out to Mike, that it never ends. And when things go as wrong as they did, and you have to live with the consequences of your choices, you can't continue to tip the scales to try to make up for it. Jimmy races home after he gets the news that she withdrew from the bar, and I liked how they showed us that her mind was made up as she calmly watches him pull into this parking spot and then mostly just listens as he freaks out. It's hard to watch for us, but his reaction is to be expected. When he bursts into their room to see that she's packing to leave, she brings up him asking if he was bad for her. And if you recall that scene, that's where she decided that she was going to do something to try to lift his spirits, which eventually sets things in motion for going after Howard. She assures Jimmy that that's not the problem, that the truth is that they're bad for each other. And when he starts to buckle under the weight, she says, "Jimmy, I have had the time of my life with you, but we are bad for everyone around us. Other people suffer because of us. Apart, we're okay, but together, we're poison." This is followed by a wonderfully painful bit of pleading that ends with Jimmy finally saying "I love you" for the first time on screen. And this is where you see her break a little as she tears up and says, "But so what?" And as devastating as this is, I think it shows how genuine their feelings are for each other. It doesn't play like this is his first time ever saying this out loud, and her coming back with a "so what." I think it drives home the idea that they say it to each other all the time off screen, and that this breakup isn't about them not feeling that way anymore. They went out of their way to show just how real that was in the last episode, and this conversation and her reasoning for the breakup all reinforces that. It's not tragic because they're falling out of love. It's that way because they are in love, and you understand that they'll continue to feel that way, but they can't be together. If that wasn't enough, when pushed about what happened to Howard not being her fault, Kim confesses that she knew. She tells him that she kept this a secret because she knew what he'd do, and that would lead to them breaking up, which is something she didn't want because she was having too much fun. On some level, Jimmy understands this and realizes there's nothing else he can say. We just watch his heart crumble from behind as she goes to the room and finishes her packing. It's the scene I was joking about in the beginning, and after that incredible jump to him waking up on a rotating bed with a sex worker, we know his transformation is complete. This flash forward is more than a stinger. It fully immerses us in the Breaking Bad timeline before the episode ends. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on, but the real point is that this is what his life looks like behind the scenes. It's something that we never got a look at in the original series, and it works really well to show how different he is now that Kim is no longer in his life. It makes sense when you look at everything that happened, and if you ever thought during the series that you couldn't wait to get Saul back, how do you feel about it now? I doubt that we've seen Kim for the last time. There's the obvious chance of her coming back during the Gene timeline, and I think it's possible that with 4 episodes to go that there could be even some scenes to show what her post-Albuquerque life looks like. For Saul, we're crossing over into old territory, but it still feels like anything could happen. Plus, there's still that call on his birthday that he mentioned in the 405 teaser. At this point, she still seems like the most likely person to be calling, which means that they aren't completely out of contact. I thought they did a fantastic job of hitting each point on the way to this conclusion. You hate to see it, but it was amazing to watch. Using Mike and Gus to show where revenge and this skewed sense of justice takes you, and then bringing it all back around to Kim's choices, worked so much better than you would have guessed it could. As it became clear that Kim would probably not be around past this episode, I was at a place where I didn't like any of the options. Partly because I didn't want the relationship to end, but more because most of the popular ones will require something drastic to happen at best, or at worst have someone or something make that decision for her. I truly appreciate that they decided to go with the idea that a character can be more than one thing at the same time. I think that this totally tracks with the Kim we've gotten to know, even though she was so committed to the scam. She seemed proof that Jimmy would never be able to do it. And I think part of what's always been interesting about these two is that despite being unbelievably capable on their own, they still needed each other. It makes it tough to watch her make this decision knowing that. And if you can't be sure where it leads, or knowing what this might do to this person that she cares about, at least you can say that she did what she had to do by herself.
It wasn't like this when I came here before.
It's showtime, folks. We're here to talk about Nippy, the 10th episode in Better Call Saul's final season. This was an episode where I experienced so many different things during this trip back to Omaha. As a person who pays as much attention to this series as a person can, I came in with some expectations. Because the last episode worked as a conclusion to the Jimmy McGill timeline, it seemed like anything was possible. Almost anything except what we actually got. With 3 episodes left to go, I would have never guessed that we might see a conclusion to Gene's problem with Jeff the cab driver. That seemed like it was all set up for the end of the series, and yet here we are. This made for a situation where I added my own additional layer of tension on top of what I was watching on the screen. As it went on, I kept expecting some big shift to happen. Was it going to turn back to color? Would we get one of those quick cuts and be right back in the Breaking Bad timeline? After all, didn't they say that Jesse and Walt were going to come back in this episode? Something felt off in this beautifully shot story of a scammer operating at the top of his game. It dripped unease, and it wasn't so much of a question of why am I watching this, but maybe something more like why am I watching this now? It turned out to be a great way for the creators to toy with those expectations I mentioned earlier. And I wouldn't say that it was a satisfying episode because it did leave me wanting more, but it was a fun break from all the heaviness we experienced in the past few episodes, and it left me fascinated about what might come next. The last time we saw Gene Takovic was in the Season 5 premiere that aired way back on February 23rd, 2020. In the previous season, he had been identified by Jeff the cab driver, who picked him up from the hospital after he fainted on his shift managing the Cinnabon. The paranoia they built up over each of his brief appearances in the series boiled over when Jeff returned to the mall and looked Gene up. His secret was out, and he thought about running again, but changed his mind, telling Ed the Disappearer that he would fix it himself. That's exactly what he does in Nippy. His plan starts with him earning the confidence of Jeff's mother, who is played by the legendary Carol Burnett. There's a quick sequence at the grocery store that hints that she might be more formidable than her son, which might turn out to be important later. I'll come back around to that. But then we see Gene pull off some of his Jimmy McGill magic. He puts some snow on Marion's path so she'll get stuck in a place where she'll notice the missing posters he's hanging up for his dog Nippy. The story opens the door to her accepting his help and gives him the chance to snip the wires on her scooter when he pushes it. That leads to him helping her all the way home, and they're sharing stories and schnapps by the time Jeffy gets there. He has to sit through an uncomfortable dinner before he can get Gene alone and try to get the upper hand back. It's already too late though. Just as Gene threw his story about Sammy Hagar back in his face, he uses the way that things played out against him. Jeff hasn't turned him in or tried to blackmail him yet, so Gene offers him something better, a chance to get in the game. He sells it by saying it's about knowing all the angles, putting it all on the line and winning. And you watch the change on Jeffy's face as he's reeled in. I guess I should mention that this is a different actor playing Jeff. They did have to recast this role because the original actor Don Harvey was under contract with We Own This City at the same time. The portrayal is a little different, but I think the new actor, Pat Healy, did a great job. If you're really having a hard time with it, maybe just think about the dynamic of him being around his mother because she seems like she runs things in that house. I also thought it felt like Bob Odenkirk found a new layer for his character in this scene. not Gene, but not exactly Saul or Jimmy either. He's there to pull Jeff in, but still jabs at him using his own words enough to make it sting later. He tells him, here's the deal. I will show you the game, and then we're done. And from there, we see him put together his multi-part plan. And just to get into the spirit of things, he pulls out Marco's pinky ring and wears it for the duration of this scam. Phase 1 is to make friends with the nighttime security guards and find out how long he can distract the one who's watching the cameras by giving him free Cinnabon. It's a lot of fun to watch as Gene works his way in here. The first guard remembers him telling the shoplifter to call a lawyer back in season 3. You see how he lightens up a little with each cinnamon roll. Gene makes friends with his partner, who is the real Mark, since he's the one he has to distract from the monitors. He throws himself into researching college football after just echoing his reactions to the game in their first conversation. There's been a question about if the Gene timeline happens in 2010 or 2011. While they're talking, they mention a Martinez setting a freshman record, and that's something that really happened in October of 2010. Saul used Ed to disappear from Albuquerque in April of that year, which means he's been living as Gene for about 6 months. If you're one of those people who were holding out hope that Walter White might still be alive in the Gene timeline, this should put that to rest since he died in September. Phase 2 is to go to the mall's department store, Lancaster's, and locate the most expensive items that Jeff could grab in the time it takes Frank to savor his nightly treat. You see Gene counting the steps from the different items, much like Gus did with his gun in the lab, but here he isn't planning to find something in the dark, he's planning on making a training course. He runs Jeff around that while shouting a rhyme he's come up with to help him remember what to grab over a bullhorn, and there isn't any question that this is a very well thought out plan. Still, it seems crazy to Jeff, and Gene has to pull out the story of Walter White to motivate him to continue. He leaves out all the terrible stuff that happened and just says, I'll tell you what's crazy. 50-year-old high school chemistry teacher comes into my office. The guy is so broke he can't pay his own mortgage. 1 year later, he's got a pile of cash as big as a Volkswagen. Phase 3 is to get Jeff into the building inside a wooden crate that can then later be used to stash the loot until the next morning. He sweet talks the store manager when she calls to complain, and then everything is set. When Frank starts eating his Cinnabon, Gene texts Jeff that it's time to go. He comes out of the crate and does just as he rehearsed on the practice field until he runs into a snag. There was a scuff mark on the floor, so the manager Kathy had called to have it cleaned up, and when Jeff ran across it, he slipped and fell. He actually knocked himself out, so Gene has to think on his feet because Frank's almost done eating, and he always immediately turns around to check the monitors, where he would be able to clearly see Jeff lying motionless in the middle of the store. He does something that we've seen him do before. He starts to spin a tale that is mostly based in truth. He starts to cry, saying that his parents are dead, his brother is dead, he has no wife, no kids, no friends. And all of this makes you think of Chuck and Kim, and it's pretty heavy. You know that on some level it's just an act, but in a way this is the most emotion he's shown about Chuck's death. He's built up enough of a rapport that Frank is sympathetic. And I thought it was a nice touch that when he asks him if he knows what he means, he's like, no, not me. Because that shows that it might be awkward enough that it wouldn't be weird if Gene no longer comes to visit anymore. It works long enough to give Jeff time to get up and to go hide in the bathroom until the morning. We see him sneak out as the delivery worker comes to pick up the crate, and it looks like they're gonna get away with it. Jeff and his friend are pumped up, but Gene brings them some bad news. He tells them all of the crimes that they've committed and explains the concept of mutually assured destruction. They can no longer threaten to turn him in because if he goes down, he'll take them with him. As he's driving this home, he echoes their first meeting in the mall when he says, "Say it." and tells them they're not friends, they're done, and not to come back looking for more. They seem to understand that they've lost, and there's one more close call when Marion comes home, where Gene is able to pretend like he's fixing the car to create a cover story. He helps her inside with her groceries, and she explains that she's happy that he's in Jeff's life because he fell in with a bad crowd in Albuquerque, and she thinks that he's doing better now that he has him in his life. She also asks him about Nippy, and it almost catches him off guard. He tells her that he got him back, and he says the line we heard a few weeks ago in the teaser trailer, "After all that, a happy ending." From there, we see him go back to work, and he looks alive again. We've seen him do this so many times in those cold open teasers, but here he is actually smiling. He's so into it, he almost forgets to go to lunch, but when reminded, he goes over to Lancaster's, and you can see that he knows that they got away with it. You see him with a look on his face where it's almost as if he's impressed with himself and how he's able to pull this off without any unintended consequences. He looks around the store, he picks up a loud shirt and tie combo, he holds it up and looks at himself in the mirror, and then he puts it down and walks away as the episode comes to an end. So my initial thought was that even though this is a great episode of Better Call Saul that continued to deliver the inevitable in a way we couldn't quite predict, I was so perplexed that he pulled everything off that it almost seemed like there was something missing. As I went back and rewatched to put these notes together, knowing what would happen, it stood out just how true to what we've seen for 6 seasons this was. It may have been in black and white, and we may have gotten the answer to how he'd take down Jeff. But what's more exciting is that feeling of not knowing what comes next. We heard most of the remaining sound bites from those mid-season break teaser trailers. We got a classic scam, quite a few laughs, a nice split-screen montage, and enough references to reward us for paying attention that it almost seemed like a reset. But if that's the case, seriously, where do we go from here? This isn't how I would choose to end Gene's story, but it could certainly feel like an ending if we didn't know there were 3 more episodes. There are 2 choices that stand out to me here. The first is that he got away with the scam and out from under Jeff clean. In my last couple of videos, I've been talking about addiction as it relates to Jimmy and Kim and their scamming. In sobriety, they say the drink or drug that will take you down is the one you get away with because that gives you the false sense that you don't need to abstain. Even though it remains in black and white, it's almost like you can see the color come back into his life at the end. But then he puts the Saul-esque clothes down and walks away. This episode shows that he'll never be happy as Gene, but also hasn't slipped completely into his old ways either. That could mean that he'll take on a brand new persona, but I'm not sure what problem he needs to solve other than he's living a boring paranoid life, and there's not much he can do about the second part of that. Restraint isn't an option, it's necessary. So if he can have a taste and walk away from it, what does that say about his character at this point in the story? The other decision that stood out was to cast Carol Burnett as Jeff's overbearing but ultimately harmless mother. It would be fine if that was all they asked her to do. Watching her spit out the Wisconsin extra sharp cheddar that had writer-producer Tom Schnauz's name attached to it was one of many great little moments. But I don't know, because in that final scene in the kitchen, I kept expecting her to turn on Gene. It would be hilarious if she tried to turn his life upside down for what he did to her Jeffy. There could be an epic showdown there to end the series. The 2 actors were great working together, so it feels like there's more potential there if they decided to go that route. This is all informed by the fact that I think making him face what he's done makes the most sense for the character's ending. I've wanted to believe that there was some Jimmy still inside there after the events of Breaking Bad, and this episode showed that at least the part where he can make people like him when he needs to is there. If the good parts are there too, then there's a chance at redemption. But it seems like it has to come via a reckoning of the harm he caused and looking at some of the things that he's kept buried. Could Marion force him to move in that direction if she makes his life complicated? Does it make more sense for it to be something related to Kim? And how will Walt and Jesse making an appearance fit in? These are great questions to have because this is the only show that I can imagine putting me in a place to absolutely have no idea. At the end of the day, it feels like a flex because it seems like they had an idea that was so good that they thought this was the best way to go about it, and I want to know what that is.
Nail salons are gone.
What? Gone? All of them?
Yep,
What about the vending machines?
gone.
Jesus! Don't tell me laser tag.
Feds found it all, Saul.
Last week, I was left wondering, would Gene be able to have another taste of the scamming life and then walk away from it? Even though that didn't seem likely, it was possible, because there was a good chance we'd be revisiting the Breaking Bad timeline to learn where the return of Bryan Cranston and Aaron Paul would fit in. Jimmy McGill first appeared in their series in an episode titled Better Call Saul, so it's fitting they would show up in episode 11, which is titled Breaking Bad. I would say that their appearance lived up to the hype. They managed to include them in a way that was more about Jimmy. It was fantastic to revisit that space and to see these two great actors play off each other one more time. But after the dust settled, I was left with a careful what you wish for feeling. Not in that it wasn't an enjoyable episode because it was great, but in the sense that there were so many payoffs I'd been waiting for that all sort of put a darker spin on things. For instance, I wanted to see more scenes with Mike. He did have a perfect ending in the Better Call Saul timeline with Papa Varga in episode 9, but it's Mike, so please find a way to bring him back as long as it's in service of Saul's story. Anyway, your 12:30 just walked in, and boom, more Mike. And as a bonus, it's during his sunglasses phase. Did I want his reappearance to be him giving Saul solid advice to avoid Walter White, only to have him completely disregard it? Not exactly. And we'll come back to the implications of that in a bit. Another thing I've been dying to know about since way back in season 4 was the phone call that Saul asked Francesca to answer on his birthday. Did I want that to be him calling to check on how things are in Albuquerque? In a word, no. I definitely did want this to mean that Kim was still alive and for them to have a chance to get back in touch with each other, but not in the way that it played out. There was a lot of important information in this conversation that I should mention, though. Things did not cool off after Walter White died. Francesca is still being watched, and since Skylar White got her deal, that only leaves Saul and Jesse for the authorities to go after. Skylar getting a deal would indicate that the lottery ticket with the GPS coordinates that Walt gave her led them to discover Hank and Gomi's bodies. Francesca hearing that Jesse's car was found near the border means that Skinny Pete's plan to have Badger ditch his car near the border in El Camino worked. We also get updates on some of the characters Saul surrounded himself with. She doesn't know what happened to Kubi, Danny, aka Price, or Ira, but I'm happy to say that Huell finally made it out of that safe house. Because the DEA held him there under false pretenses, he walked and is presumably back home in Louisiana. ADA Bill Oakley left the courthouse vending machines behind and became a defense attorney. And seeing his Saul-esque bus bench advertisements was a great way to explain visually that we were back in Albuquerque and some time had passed. The call turns out to be a wonderful send-off for Francesca that is made all the better by her hanging up before Gene says, "I guess this is goodbye." And the last big piece of information is that the only person who called her after it all went down was Kim. She asked if Jimmy was still alive, and he interprets this as, "You mean there's a chance she might want to get back together?" because he has his U-turn moment when he gets to a crossroads and decides to go back to call her. Apparently he knows where she works, or at least thinks he does. And just as he makes the call and asks for her, we're cut out of the conversation. From what we watch from across the street, it feels safe to say that making the call was a bad idea, but we'll have to wait to find out why that was. We do see his rageful reaction that involves smashing the receiver and kicking in the glass for good measure. Because this is so extreme, I think it only makes sense that he did talk to her. And as frustrating as it is not to know what was said, the effect it has on him is what really matters. After Kim left, we found out that he became Saul as a way to cope with everything that happened. We know Jimmy never dealt with Chuck's or Howard's deaths, and that he tries to forget about what happened with Kim by throwing himself into being the criminal lawyer Saul Goodman. After episode 609, that put a sad spin on the character's existence during Breaking Bad, but this episode makes things more complicated. I already mentioned him ignoring Mike's warning about Walt, and what that brought to mind was the switch in his office in the first episode of season 2. That made the point that when he gets something in his mind, he can't help himself, and they jump back and forth between the two timelines to really drive this idea home. In Omaha, he's reeling from whatever Kim told him on the phone, and so he heads back to Jeff's where he shows Marion how to watch funny cat videos on her new laptop. I thought the way Odenkirk played Gene here was really telling. He's laughing with her 1 minute, but gets deadly serious when he tells Jeff they should take their drinks outside. He needs to throw himself into this as fast as possible to drown out his thoughts of Kim. The scams start off feeling fun in the same way that Nippy was. He appears to pick marks that aren't nice people, and especially the first one feels like he might even have it coming to him. He uses the name Victor with a K, and it feels like he might be chasing some of what he got out of those early scams with Giselle. We see that he has things planned out. He has Jeff take the night shift and obtain some barbiturates. Gene finds guys he can befriend at bars while pretending to get drunk with them, and then have Jeff drug them with complimentary water on the way home. He uses a piece of tape to leave their doors unlocked so that Buddy can come in behind him and steal their identities while they're knocked out. They sell their information for a decent payday and then do it all again. In Albuquerque, it's been a few years since Kim left, so at this point he's just chasing a bigger high. After his post-kidnap conversation where he put it together that Walter is Heisenberg, he sees an opportunity. I suppose that some people might look at this as Saul being responsible for who Walter White will become, but I think that is missing the point of who Heisenberg was. We have two stories about two different journeys, so I look at this as it being what happens when they come together. And I've always thought of their transformations as being unique to each other, but at least at the end of this episode, they're looking a lot more similar. Because things do get dark quickly in Omaha as Gene starts to resemble Saul a lot more than Jimmy. He was already wearing the pinky ring, and he adds a Bluetooth headset and the back massager, and he starts sleeping with sex workers again. There's a moment when he realizes that one of his marks has cancer, where you think he might pump on the brakes, but it goes in the opposite direction. He gets a call and rushes over to Jeff's because Buddy couldn't go through with his part of the robbery. He noticed that their Mark took the same cancer meds his dad was taking and decides not to steal from him. Gene flips out and tries to convince him that he'll get over it, and when that doesn't work, he decides to do it himself. There's a great shot on the way to the house with Jeff looking at Gene in his rearview mirror, where you can see that he's really afraid of him at this point. It's a complete 180 from when he was first in his cab, and it underlines how quickly and completely that Gene went off the rails. Everything about this decision to go to the house is compulsive. It's been long enough that the barbiturates may no longer be working. Buddy removed the tape so he won't be able to walk right in. And when he breaks the window, that undermines the entire purpose of the scam. They were going to great lengths to make sure these guys wouldn't realize they'd been robbed. And as the episode comes to an end, we know that won't be the case this time. And as they've done throughout the episode, they cut back and forth between the two timelines. And there's a great parallel of him walking into Walt's high school here with what Gene does at the end of this episode. The decision to go to Walt and to tell him he has the right product, but not the right connections and strategy, and then offer to provide him those things. It was the beginning of the end for Saul Goodman. It makes this final decision to go after this other cancer man feel like it could be the end of Gene. So careful what you wish for. This episode gave us answers and the return of Walt and Jesse, but it made the Jimmy side winning the battle for his soul feel less likely. They were almost hitting us over the head with the similarities between the fall of Saul Goodman and the end of Gene Takovic. In both of those situations, he was making decisions and chasing after what he was wishing for, and we know what that's about now. And at least in the Breaking Bad timeline, we know how that worked out. I really liked how they managed the jumping back and forth, and the transition of the grave in the desert to him awake in the bed he made for himself in Omaha really sticks with you. There's an incredible amount of references, like the gas station where Francesca gets the call is the same one where Jesse gave the girl at the counter meth. And speaking of that, the whole find a rock shaped like New Jersey and follow the fishing line to the drain pipe was fun to watch. I don't know if I needed the answer to what happened to Huel, but I was happy when I got it. And I read in the Hollywood Reporter that Thomas Schnauz said that he named Price Daniel because he was hoping to make him the Danny from the laser tag, and they never got around to it. So he was excited to slip that in during the call and make it official. I also saw several posts that pointed out that he was pictured on one of the driver's licenses during the montage. As we become used to with this show, and I would say in his episodes in particular, it was a heavy episode with just the right amount of funny moments included to balance things out. There were so many things in the crystal ship. You had him asking if Oakley came out, the massage machine itself, and Mike's reaction to it. Francesca as a landlord, Marion with funny cat videos, and I'm not sure if it was supposed to be funny, but I did find Buddy's incredibly well-behaved dog to be a nice touch. It's not like this is a surprise, but I have to mention the performances. Watching Odenkirk play Saul and possibly showing us a new side of Gene after the phone call, it's wild how each one of these different versions of Jimmy comes across. Cranston and Paul, with the aid of some beanies, seem to slip right back into their roles. I think if I had to choose a favorite moment, it would be Jesse saying dick under his breath, but Walt's lecture about how they just need to let it cool down is right up there with it. The last thing I got that I really wanted was to see Gene and Kim reconnect. And I would have never guessed that it could lead to him putting himself on this path. Because we didn't hear what they said, and because we don't know what she's up to, I feel pretty confident that we're going to see this same conversation from her side in the next episode. She is working at a store that sells sprinklers, and it's titled Waterworks. Based on the timing, it's possible she just learned what he was up to with Walt. It stands out, though, that he thought he knew where she worked. He was able to call the operator and get in touch with her just like that. It's hard to say where we go in the timeline from here. It doesn't necessarily feel like we need to revisit anything with Walt and Jesse, although I wouldn't mind it. But him having this information makes it seem like it's at least possible that they got together at least once during the Breaking Bad timeline. What they said and whether that happened or if he just had someone go find her, all of that being a mystery means that we really have no idea how she'd be feeling about him. As far as the way things were left after episode 609, it's safe to say that she still cares about him. She doesn't believe that they can be together, but she wouldn't want him to be suffering either. Considering she knows what he's been through and she knows him better than anyone else, she may understand what he's doing with this Saul Goodman persona. At the very least, she understands that him burying all these unresolved feelings about Chuck, about Howard, that none of that's good for him. But without knowing what she's facing in her own life, it's hard to imagine how those two things will influence each other if there's any chance that he turns things around. Because at the end of this episode, he looks set up to go down in a blaze of glory, similar to Mr. Walter White. I never envisioned that as an ending for him, so I'm interested to see if there's a way that he can resolve that, if he can move past that, and there's still 2 more full episodes to go to see if he does. What if you were in love and alive and you and your partner did something that made it absolutely clear that you are poisoned together? And then when you tried to do the right thing and separate, things didn't exactly improve? Waterworks is an episode where we see 2 very different approaches to that situation. Neither is easy to watch, but one is far more destructive. And that will bring Gene Takovic to a place where he has a telephone cord wrapped around his hands as he hovers over an elderly woman who did nothing to deserve the situation she's found herself in. As you'd expect from a penultimate episode of a long-running series, there are some major developments. There is one I keep going back to, though, and that's Kim's return to Saul's office in the Breaking Bad timeline. I'm not sure exactly when this is supposed to take place. It's been long enough that he's remodeled it to look more like the Cathedral of Justice that she mentioned back in episode 601, but still some time before he started working with Walter White. The first thing that sticks out is that he sits and thinks for an hour before he lets his soon-to-be ex-wife into the office. He can't just open up and let whatever might happen happen. There's a callback to his time working in the cell phone store as he bounces a ball off his desk and thinks about how to approach the signing of his divorce papers and seeing Kim again. As he's done so many times before, he goes with the most frustrating option. I can't help but think of Chuck's decision to tell Jimmy that he never really mattered to him the last time they saw each other because it wipes me out in the same way. And this could be the last time they see each other. Saul busies himself with his phone and even takes time for a fist pump, while Kim only gets out about 10 words total if you don't count the ums. To her credit, she's sticking to her guns as far as the decision she made at the end of episode 609. And Saul, well, he's just dedicated to not showing any fragment of an emotion. This is just one of many tragic points in a larger tragic story, but what makes it linger is that we know these characters enough for this to make sense. And what's worse is that they know each other. Kim has seen this before. She knows what she's looking at, and on some level knows there's nothing she can do about it. He shuts down any real chance of a conversation, and she struggles to think of something to say after his final words, "Have a nice life, Kim." She can't. And she doesn't, and before she can get away, he's already calling in his next client. There are a couple of things worth mentioning here. He calls Francesca Sweet Cheeks, which I suppose at least hints he's on the path to becoming the person who uttered the "you're killing me with that booty" line right before he's kidnapped by Walt and Jesse in his first episode. Also, his next client is Emilio, who will turn out to be the first person Walt kills in the pilot episode of Breaking Bad, and who you might remember as a pile of liquefied remains that fall through the ceiling after Jesse fails to follow Walt's instruction when he dissolves his body. Emilio was how Jesse heard Saul was a criminal lawyer in the first place, and when Kim decides to have a cigarette outside, she runs into Mr. Pinkman himself. This scene wasn't completely essential. There was a brief mention of combo, which was a nice addition, but it basically boiled down to the question of if Saul was actually a good lawyer. It was still great to see these two characters cross paths, though, considering they inhabit similar spaces in their respective series. And we're watching Kim leave Saul's orbit, and Jesse before he's pulled into Walt's. These two were both complicit. They went along with what was happening, and Kim even drove the bus towards the end, but you got the sense that it affected them more. Plus, I think it makes sense for Kim to have to think about this question, and I like the answer. When I knew him, he was. It underlines that she's leaving now for good and has no control over what comes next for Jimmy. Chronologically, this is the first time that we see them interact after the fateful night where she told him that she loved him too, but so what? But it isn't the last. Jump forward to 2010 and she's living in Florida, still not practicing law, and no longer sporting the trademark blonde ponytail. Everything is kinda fine. I mean, she lives in a house, has a decent job, and a boyfriend, and I suppose anything normal might not feel right for her, even if this seems amazingly dull. But what really makes this feel sad is her avoiding every single decision or chance to even offer an opinion. One, I don't know, what do you think, is too many, and this is apparently how she goes through life all the time. It's a massive change from the Kim we used to know, who never let other people make decisions for her. She's wearing white sneakers, apparently can't even pick a picture for her puzzle, and what probably hit the hardest was her not even being able to decide if she can make potato salad with Miracle Whip instead of mayonnaise. These are two different things, and it made me a little bit worried, at least until she actually notices the difference when she's eating her sandwich at lunch the next day. It all feels so unnatural, but she is actually doing it. She's doing the thing that later will be reminded that Jimmy can't do. She's living a life where there's no chance that she'll inadvertently cause harm to anyone else. I love the way that director Vince Gilligan took the time to focus on how mundane it actually is, and how good she is at doing this job, even though the stakes are much lower than when she was a lawyer. So that when we get to see the other end of that phone call from the last episode, it feels like it could upend everything. I looked at everything that the internet had put together about this phone call last week and still couldn't have guessed how it played out. Watching her draw the blinds and prepare after she hears the name Victor with a K St. Clair really highlighted how they both throw themselves into the lives they've taken on to deal with this thing that they're having to live with. Now he's pushing his way into her new reality, and it makes sense that it's not what Kim says that gets him going on the phone, but that she doesn't say anything. She just says, "What do you want?" and listens. He doesn't know what to do with that and the hurt that comes along with it, and just escalates things on his own. He doesn't even revert to being Jimmy, which is the man that she loved and likely still loves. He skips straight to Saul mode and just stays there after she tells him he shouldn't be calling. We know that she knows about Walt and that Saul's on the run, and when he keeps pushing for her to say something, she tells him he should turn himself in. Then it's like we're back in that office and he turns the tables in an instant. Why doesn't she turn herself in? Seeing how she's the one with the guilty conscience, what's stopping her? He throws out that Fring is dead, Mike is dead, and Lalo is apparently dead, which I guess might make her feel safe enough to do what she does later. But there's a moment where he's almost coming back down as she almost starts to crack, and as he repeats her name, she says, "I'm glad you're still alive," and hangs up. There's a moment where it feels like it might end there when she's swept up to sing happy birthday to the receptionist. I guess Tammy shares the same birthday as Jimmy, and it's wild to see Kim put on a smile and sing to her. It doesn't end there though. In the very next scene, we see Kim arrive back in Albuquerque. There are so many callbacks and references in this episode that I gave up on trying to include them all, but there are a couple of things here that jump out. The shot where the sign for Alaska Airlines comes into focus makes you think of Jesse's ending, and we saw that this sign used to say Wayfarer when Marie was dropping off Hank back in season 3. There's also this one-to-one shot of Kim walking out the door that matches Walt coming back out of the airport in season 2 after Skyler dropped him off. And after she gets her rental car and heads to the courthouse, there are, of course, several things that jump out. Mike left his parking lot job way before he died, but now we see that it's been automated. This isn't very subtle, but it does work great to show how everything's changed. None of the familiar faces are there. It's like a ghost town in a way, but everything continues on. There's a bittersweet moment when she sees the table where they talked before they got married, and inside she sees a new lawyer with a new ponytail preparing her client to go into the courtroom. It's not immediately clear what she's doing at the courthouse, but it comes into focus when she goes to visit Howard's wife Cheryl at home. She hands her an affidavit to read, and as we see snippets of that, it really does a great job of showing what they did for what it was. I thoroughly enjoyed watching them plan and execute this scam because it was presented in a super entertaining way. Looking at it in black and white through the eyes of someone who not only lost a loved one, but was denied the truth of what really happened, it hits so much differently. There's an understanding that coming clean doesn't undo the harm that was caused, and she can't provide real closure since she doesn't know where the body is. But this is the best that can be done as far as Kim taking responsibility. There is no physical evidence, no remaining witnesses except Jimmy, and there's a real chance that the DA will decide not to prosecute. Cheryl asks him why she's doing this, but it cuts away before we hear her response. It isn't until she's on the rental car shuttle bus that I realize she's no longer wearing her trademark earrings. And it's there that we see her break down and let it all out. It builds slowly, and it gets to a point where she can't hold it in any longer, and Ray Seehorn delivers one of the most heart-wrenching scenes of this or any other series. I thought it was an amazing touch to have the stranger sitting next to her reach out her hand for comfort, because you have to think that inside the character's mind that she doesn't believe she deserves that. Just a few scenes back, it was as if she didn't believe she deserved to make her own decisions. And if this turned out to be the last time we saw Kim Wexler, I could be okay with that because it was just that moving. I'm not the first one to bring this up. I'm sure I won't be the last, but I really hope that we'll see Ray Seehorn win some awards for this because it's really just an amazing performance. I said that Gene skipped straight to Saul mode and stayed there, and we saw that in the last episode. We left him after he broke into the Cancer Man's house, and we pick up with him in the same place. Everything goes according to plan at first. The guy is still knocked out. Gene gets all the pictures he needs and eventually finds his passwords. There's another little Breaking Bad reference here. When he looks at his bank statement, he has $737,000 in his account, which is the same amount of money that Walt thought he needed to earn in order to take care of his family after he died. Jeff returns right on time, and it's here where things take a turn. He has a chance to walk outside, but he decides to take another look around and starts to pocket some of his expensive watches. The Mark wakes up and ends up blocking his exit by sitting on the stairs, and Gene prepares to hit him over the head with an urn containing the ashes of his beloved dog Rusty so that he can get past him. He won't have to do that because he passes back out, but considering the way things have been going since that phone call to Kim, it's enough to know that he was ready to do it. It's sort of like when she walked up to Gus's house with a gun. It doesn't matter that she never had to kill him. It matters that she was willing to do that for Jimmy. If it hadn't already been abundantly clear, now we know that he's completely out of control. While he's on his way out, a police car pulls up behind Jeff to have their lunch. He doesn't know anything about the subpar fish tacos or anything else that's going on in the car, and manages to deliver a pretty funny moment in the middle of a very heavy episode of television. He slams on the gas and plows into a car just around the corner so that Gene can make his way out of the house. He makes it back home and waits for the call. We see him do his little magic fingers while he's waiting like he did way back in season 1. When the call comes through, Jeff informs him that the cops know there was a robbery and are trying to pin it on him, but since there's no evidence that he was involved, he tells him to breathe deep and sit tight. He'll have him out by lunchtime. It appears that this shift to Saul is serving him well. The only loose end is that he needs to get Marion up to speed so that she can go over and pay his bail. When he's doing that, he makes another slip up on the phone when he tells her they just have to pay straight cash bail, and it's nothing like what she experienced back in Albuquerque. This catches her by surprise because he told her he'd never been there, and when he gets to her house, he finds out she's not ready because she's been looking things up on her laptop. When he opens it up, he sees one of his old commercials, and we see it reflected in color on his glasses. This is a callback to the first episode when he was watching the VHS tape of the same commercials, and we had the only other instance of color in any of the Gene scenes. What's funny is that it was hard to imagine how she would learn about his identity, and the solution of having her put Con Man and Albuquerque into Ask Jeeves is perfect. When she tries to plug the phone back in to call the police, he rips the cord out of the wall, and we have reached the point where we believe he might actually be capable of killing her. This is absolutely the most scary that we've ever seen this character. He does try again to talk her down, and she grabs the life alert panic button she wears around her neck. He leans in and grabs it too, but when she says, "I trusted you," we see a crack in his facade. He lets her go and she pushes it. When the operator checks on her, she explains the situation and they say they'll call the police. And the episode ends with Gene/Saul/Jimmy running out of her house. They did it again. They made the inevitable seem truly amazing, and they took us places where we might not have been expecting to go while having the characters remain true to who they are. A lot of things I guessed would happen in this episode did happen, but in ways that it still felt surprising. I was wowed by the performances, even though I already know how good these actors are, and it's crazy that they find a way to go to the next level. I can't imagine a way I could be more excited about the upcoming series finale. This is just a TV show firing on all cylinders, and I can't wait to see how it ends. It's a little difficult to watch Gene go so completely dark, but there's that part at the end where there's still a little bit of humanity inside there. He could have stopped her, and he didn't, and that leaves some room for something interesting to happen in the next episode.
He was an incredible lawyer. He's the most brilliant guy I ever met, but he was limited. I tried. I could have tried harder.
I imagine at some point there was a meeting where Peter Gould explained a vital piece of information to his costume director. I'm going to need you to find a suit that goes so hard that it drips Saul Goodman even when we see it in black and white. After all, this is a man getting dressed for his own funeral. Saul Gone is the rare TV series finale where I got everything that I wanted and then some. It managed to give me more than what I was willing to expect for fear of being disappointed. I may not have necessarily been hoping to see Gene turn so hard into being Saul, but what I thought was brilliant in the way this was put together was that the writers led me on a journey where, because of what I know about the characters, I could more or less anticipate each step, and it all felt right. Once again, they managed to make it exciting, even though ultimately the characters do what we expect them to do. And to be fair, it's a lot more cerebral than what I imagine some people were wanting. So I guess I could see how it might not land for some, but I'll come back around to my thoughts about why it worked after I recap what happened. Spoiler alert, because Jimmy didn't get away with it and still found redemption from the only person that matters to him. Episode 13 opens with the first of 3 flashbacks, which in his interview with Alan Sepinwall, Peter Gould compared to A Christmas Carol. In the episode, we watch Gene become Saul, and he's visited by 3 ghosts. The first is Mike Ehrmentraut, which happens during their trek through the desert back in episode 508, Bagman. I guess if we really wanted to put this in context for the timeline, since he still has his urine in the Davison main bottle when he finally gets phone service, this would have to be after they make contact and no help is on the way. Jimmy brings up the idea of keeping the $7 million, and when Mike explains why that would be a bad idea, he lays out his plan. Take the first $6 million and build a time machine. That leads to the question of where's the first place you'd go. Mike says back to December 8th, 2001, which I presume is the night he killed his son Maddie's murderers based on the timing of things. But he quickly updates that to the first day he took a bribe and became a crooked cop. What's more important than his answer is that he's being honest, which Jimmy shows is something he's incapable of when he talks about going back to invest the rest of his money. This is before Howard died and before Kim left him, and so before he ever decided to go full Saul to try to relieve his pain. So we know his answer is BS. This lack of honesty will continue through the second flashback where we go back to Ed the Disappear's basement during the events of the penultimate episode of Breaking Bad. Before Saul was carried off to become Gene in Omaha and Walt was stashed away in New Hampshire, they spent some time together and Saul brought up the time machine question again. Walt, being the arrogant prick he is, dismisses it as a meaningless question because that kind of time travel is impossible, as it would violate the second law of thermodynamics. This takes us a step closer to what the whole thing is about when Walt calls it what it is. Saul is asking him about his regrets. Mr. White almost gets there when he mentions gray matter, but quickly shifts the blame away from himself by saying that his partners were artfully maneuvering him into making his decision. Saul still can't come up with anything real, so he brings up a slip and fall that still gives him pain, and to that Walt says, "So you were always like this." This sounds a lot like the third ghost, his brother Chuck, and is something that would later be echoed by Howard Hamlin right before he died. And I do think this is crucial to what they're trying to say with this story, so I will definitely come back to it at the end. Before we get into that, this finale is about change, and before that can happen, Jimmy/Saul/Gene has to make a choice. To get us there, the present-day timeline picks up right where episode 12 left off. We saw a glimpse of Jimmy when he didn't stop Marion from pushing the button on her life alert, but now he's fully Gene in survival mode trying to escape. On his way out, in her last dramatic contribution, Marion is able to get his license plate number, which means it doesn't take the police long to track him down. There's a short chase where it seems like he might have a chance to get away. I mean, he still has those diamonds and Ed's number, right? Yes, but no. His escape ends in a dumpster, which is a nice reference to the beginning of the Sandpiper case back in season 1. In case you weren't sure where his head was, it can be kind of confusing. His first call is to Cinnabon to tell them they'll be needing a new manager. After that, he sort of falls apart in the holding cell, and at his lowest point looks up to see "My lawyer will ream you" as carved on the wall. He starts to laugh, and in this instant becomes Saul Goodman. In the script for the episode, Peter Gould wrote that as a fugitive, he was playing a game he didn't know. But now that he's in the system, his system, he's like Kal-El waking up under a yellow sun. In this place, he has superpowers. And we see him get right down to the business of putting those to use. He calls Bill Oakley, who Francesca told him had switched sides to become a defense lawyer, and he sets out to get himself a deal. On the way to meet with the lawyers, he sees Marie Schrader and uses her as a prop to show them what they're up against. After listening to a heartfelt monologue about losing her husband and what she'd like to see happen to Saul, he responds in kind with a story about how he got dragged into working with Walter White. He mentions being taken to the desert and having a gun pointed at his head, and how that scared him into doing everything he did. It's the kind of performance we've seen before, and he basically looks sincere. No one in the room believes this to be true, and the prosecutor doesn't think a jury will either, but that's not what's important. As Saul points out, all he needs is one, and that reality is enough to bring them to the table. He gets them to agree to a really generous deal where he'll serve 7 years at the prison of his choice. It's Saul at full throttle, and while 7 years is not nothing, this would pretty much go down as a legendary win given the circumstances. It almost ends there, but when he pushes for a pint of Bluebell mint chocolate chip ice cream in exchange for information about Howard Hamlin's death, he learns about Kim going back to Albuquerque to file her affidavit with the DA. While that steals his thunder as far as the mint chocolate chip is concerned, it gets worse when Bill tells him on the flight back that even though there are no witnesses, and the DA probably won't do anything with it, she also went to confess to Cheryl in person, which means she'll be able to bring a civil suit against her. We see that this gives Saul an idea, but it's not at all clear what his angle is. He tells Bill to tell the prosecution that he has more information about Howard. This is somewhat confusing because, as Bill points out, anything he tells them might be bad for Kim. Plus, we know that Kim isn't looking for him to save her. But at this point, we have to sort of give it to him that he knows better than us. After the end of the last episode, I was hoping that Kim's breakdown on her way out of Albuquerque would mark the end of the indecisive life she was leading in Florida. We take a brief trip there to see that it is starting to happen, but that it's going slow. It's not Jimmy turning into Saul or Kim waking up in the morning and snapping back to be her old self. In a scene at lunch with her co-workers at Palm Coast, she still struggles to offer an opinion. But later, we see her go to the local legal aid office and volunteer. It's a step in the right direction, and I loved how the woman is so busy that she doesn't offer much in the way of her having to make a decision. She just tells her to answer the phone, and we see how she lights up and rises to the challenge right away. Unfortunately, any newfound peace she achieved from this is dashed away when she gets a call from ADA Erickson. She tells her that Saul's in custody and that he's giving testimony that affects her personally. Cut to Saul Goodman being led into the courtroom with that sharkskin suit I mentioned at the beginning of the video. We see that his plan worked because Kim is there, and as he derails his deal by telling the truth, we start to understand what he was trying to do. He tells the court that he lied about her involvement in Howard's murder just because he wanted her to be there to hear what he had to say. He started off with the same story he told Marie about being afraid of Walt, but admits that it didn't last long. He saw an opportunity and did everything he could to help Walt build his empire. We know that all of this came from his coping mechanism that he put into place after she left. And there's a moment after Bill hilariously tries to withdraw from the case where he looks back to see that Kim is certainly watching, but he can tell he hasn't quite won her over yet, which at this point is clearly all he's trying to do. He brings up Howard, and by now Saul is gone. He mentions that Kim had the guts to leave town and to start over, but he was the one who ran away. Now that he's really looking at the truth, he moves on to admit that he got Chuck's insurance canceled because he saw a chance to hurt him, and that he'll have to live with the fact that he went on to commit suicide. And while this is all coming from a person who we know would say just about anything if it would help him, the fact that it doesn't here shows us that he's telling the truth. There are some visual clues to enforce it as well. When he mentions Chuck, it cuts to a wide shot where we can see the exit sign a la chicanery and hear the electric hum. And there's a shot of Kim where she's framed like she's in the crosshairs from the railing in the courtroom. It's also in the performance, and in the way he says the name's McGill, I'm James McGill, but where it really counts for him, and for everyone who fell in love with the characters on this show, where it really counts is that Kim believes him. He looks back at her one last time, and when he doesn't see the response right away, he drops his eyes. But when he looks back up, Ray Seehorn does the most subtle bit of facial acting, where she doesn't really do a look, but the tension in her face sort of eases up just enough to where you see that it got through to her. And in case you didn't pick up on that, it's made explicit when he gets called for a meeting with his lawyer. I completely expected this to be Kim through the long drawn-out reveal, but thought that it meant that she'd been reinstated and was moving on and practicing law again. In reality, she just used her New Mexico bar card that doesn't have an expiration date, and boy was I glad that she did. And a beautiful callback to the first scene they had together back in season 1, she pulls out a cigarette and they share it up against the wall. Her hands are shaking as she tries to light it, and when he helps her steady them, you see that the flame and then the cherry on the cigarette is in color. It ain't much, but it's theirs, and it's a spark that comes from that thing that they share. You learn that instead of 7 years, he ends up doing 86 for telling the truth. So even though he mentions good behavior, it seems safe to say that he'll never get out of there. This is a fictional prison as far as I can tell, so it's not even clear if she'll come back to visit. This could be the only time they see each other. But again, that's not what's important here. As Kim walks out and fights off tears, she gets one more look at Jimmy in the yard, and it's clear that no matter what happens, it was enough for him to have just one more moment with her. In the closing shot, he gives her the finger guns, and this time it's a sign that Saul's gone. When she turns again before he's out of sight, you know that she knows that he didn't do it to get out of trouble or to win her over, but to set himself free. It ain't much, but given what he's done, it's also kind of everything. So in the end, he didn't get away with it. He didn't even get what Walt or Nacho did, a chance to go out on his own terms. In the first half of this show, I thought the tragedy was that Jimmy, a character who at his core was always looking to be liked by everyone and to be loved ultimately, was looking in a place where he could never get it. His brother Chuck, a complicated character who was broken in different ways to the point of not being able to give it to him. For the way things played out, it was more about him not being able to find himself as all these things were happening. Chuck's death, the ordeal in the desert, Lalo, Howard's death, losing Kim, and the entirety of his time with Walter White. He may have brought most of this on himself, but these things ended up defining him in his not being able to move past them. Each thing sent him further away from the good that was in there, and each made it harder to change. What I really liked about this is that his most self-destructive period came after Kim made the hard but sensible decision to leave after Howard's death. So it's fitting that when he finally comes around, it's after he finds out that she came clean to try to make that right. No one is saving anyone, but the thing that they share, that connection, means enough to get Jimmy to start the process of changing. It smashes Chuck's idea that Jimmy was born that way and that it was pointless for him to try to be something different. It also shows that he's not the same type of character as Walter. With him, I always believed that getting cancer was the thing that allowed him to become what was always under the surface. He was motivated to get respect and fear he thought he deserved and was being denied in his life, and Heisenberg was the realization of that. Jimmy came off as more complicated because after you met him, you started to wonder if the Saul persona you already knew might all just be an act. It turned out to be something else, something more self-destructive, but it wasn't terminal like Walt's cancer. Jimmy under the surface just wanted to be loved, and through his time with Kim learned what that could be. Because that's the thing. None of us have time machines, and as Jimmy found out, none of us can run from our past forever. We can just go forward trying to make better decisions and make the ones that the people we care about would appreciate. Jimmy only earned one smoke and one long last look, but it's worlds better than anything Saul Goodman ever was a part of. I don't think it's a traditionally happy ending, but it could have been a lot worse, especially given how many people die in this universe. For Jimmy, being in jail might not be the end of the world. I think you get a sense of that here. If I could have left one thing out of this, maybe it would be that bus ride chant, which was a little bit much. But either way, you can imagine that he'd be able to handle himself in there. Nothing about what he did would appear to help Kim's situation with Cheryl's civil suit, but I suppose she would feel that it's a just punishment. Also, Jimmy could have really wasted the opportunity if he tried to solve that problem for her. They both paid the price for their mistakes to some extent. They both got there by their own means, and by finally taking some responsibility and looking at the part he played in the pain he carried around, he gets to be Jimmy again. And speaking of Chuck, when Jimmy was doing his thing in court, right after he said his brother was a brilliant lawyer, he added that he was limited. It seemed like a really strange choice of words at the time, but it ties in really wonderfully with the final Ghost of Christmas Past flashback. In that, we see them in what appears to be the time right before season 1 started. Did you ground yourself? It's like music to the ears, and there are about 1,000 references packed into this short interaction, but what stands out the most is that, at least in this case, Chuck is the one that would like Jimmy to stay so they can talk. As isolated as he was, you never got the sense that he was lonely, and I suppose neither did Jimmy. They go back and forth and you see a warmer side of Chuck. Even though there's the sense that he might be trying to talk him out of practicing law to balance things out. It doesn't recontextualize their relationship, but it is a reminder that Chuck did care for his brother in that limited way that Jimmy mentioned. It wasn't what he wanted, but there was something there. And it's here that we see the copy of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells that popped up in the season 6 premiere in Saul's mansion, and again in Jimmy's room in episode 2. My initial interpretation was that this meant that this was Jimmy's answer to the time machine question. Maybe he would come back and have this conversation with his brother, rather than rushing off to try to impress him by being something he thought he had no business being. And in the end, it turns out he was pretty good at that. His being leaned back in his chair as he listened to his deal put that on full display. It was glorious, but it wasn't everything. And I think that is a great place to leave things. So let me know in the comments what you thought about the ending of Better Call Saul and how it worked as the ending of the Breaking Bad universe. There's a ton of references and things I had to cut out because there was so much going on that I really wanted to focus on this change that Jimmy was going through. As heavy as it was, it managed to throw in some great laughs. I cracked up when Bill tried to quit the case and when Walt told Saul to stay in his lane. It really is the end, and the callbacks and references really made it feel that way. The impact that common items like the Wayfarer headrest on the airplane, or when Walt takes a second to look at the watch that Jesse gave him for his birthday. I'm gonna miss seeing things like that pop up. And the writing and the acting and everything, I mean, last week was sort of Ray Seehorn's showcase, and this week was all about Bob Odenkirk. Of course, everyone involved did a terrific job, but I have to point out how skillfully he went through this episode, changing from one of the characters to the other that all exist inside this same person. There's just nothing else like it, and I could go on forever, but I won't. I want to thank you all for watching this season with me. You all helped to make it a blast. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.